Hey there, and welcome back. If you are lying in the dark now, with the day folded away behind you and the house gone quiet, then there is nothing left for you to do tonight, nothing to carry and nothing to solve. Only to let your breathing slow and let the warmth gather, and let me take you somewhere far from here. Tonight we are going back more than 600 years into the England of candlelight and cold stone and slow rivers, to follow the life of a woman who began with almost nothing and ended as the second lady in all the land. A woman whose name the proud chroniclers of her age tried to blacken and could not, whose story is the greatest love story the medieval English court ever knew. She was the daughter of a poor foreign knight, raised on the charity of a queen, married young to a muddy Lincolnshire manor, and she should, by every rule of her rigid world, have lived and died unremembered, a knight's widow in a fenland house. Instead, she became the beloved of the greatest prince in England, the mother of a line of children born outside marriage who would rise to cardinals and earls and the grandmothers of kings, and at the very last, against every expectation of her age, she became a duchess, married in a vast cathedral to the man she had loved in secret for a quarter of a century. And from this low-born woman, the chroniclers called a temptress and a she-devil, there came down in time the blood of nearly every English monarch who has reigned from her own day to ours. Her name was Katherine, and tonight her whole long life is ours to wander through. Slowly, from the foreign girl in the Queen's household to the Duchess in her tomb of Lincoln stone, and there is nothing for you to remember. For the names and the years will drift over you like water, and somewhere in the telling you will fall asleep. And that is exactly as it should be. Before we set out, let me say one quiet thing to you, the one who has chosen to spend these dark hours here with me rather than anywhere else. If you find, somewhere along the way tonight, that this telling has done what it came to do, that it has loosened the grip of the day and carried you gently down towards sleep, then you would be most welcome to stay a while in this company, to let this be a place you come back to on the nights when rest is slow in coming and the dark feels long. There is a small and simple way to do that, with the button beneath this, and it asks nothing of you and only lets me know you would like to find your way back here again. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie, the city or the village or the quiet country dark, the rain on the glass or the snow on the sill or the warm still air of summer, for these messages reach me from every corner of the earth, from people lying just as you are lying now, and I look through them, every one, and they are among the truest pleasures of these long nights. But all of that can wait. For now, there is only a girl in a queen's household 600 years ago, and the long and astonishing life that lies before her. Picture this. It is the middle years of the 14th century, and we are in the household of the Queen of England, a warm and crowded and busy world within the cold stone of the royal palaces, full of damsels and waiting women and pages and clerks, all moving about the person of the Queen. The Queen is Philippa, a kind and much-loved lady who came to England from the county of Hainault, in the Low Countries across the sea, to marry the young King Edward, and she has never forgotten the land of her birth, and keeps about her a little company of folk from her own country, knights and ladies who came with her or followed after. Among them is a knight named Paon de Roet, a Hainaulter like the Queen, who has served her faithfully and who has brought his children to be raised in the warmth and the safety of her household, where a poor knight's daughters might be given an upbringing and a polish far above their station. And among those children, small and dark-eyed and watchful, learning the ways of the court, the manners and the needlework and the soft, careful speech of vast households, is a little girl who will one day be a duchess. Though no one looking at her now, this foreign knight's daughter, living on a queen's kindness, could ever begin to guess it. Her name is Katherine, and this is where her story begins. To understand what it meant to be raised in the Queen's household, you must picture the strange and privileged world of it. The household of a medieval queen was a great institution, a moving community of hundreds of people, ladies and damsels and chamberwomen, knights and squires and pages, clerks and cooks and grooms, all of them ordered into a careful hierarchy around the person of the queen and travelling with her from palace to palace as the court moved through the year. It was at once a home, a school, a workplace, and a marriage market, the place where the daughters of the well-born were sent to be finished and matched. And for a child without vast wealth or rank, it was the surest road to advancement that the age could offer. Queen Philippa was known throughout the kingdom for her warmth and her kindness, a queen genuinely loved by her people, generous to those who served her, and loyal to the folk of her native Hainaut. And a girl raised under her eye was raised in about the kindest and most cultivated household in all of England. Catherine grew up there among the children of knights and lords, sharing their lessons and their games and their small ceremonies, learning by daily imitation the whole code of how the great behaved, and absorbing, without ever being taught it as a lesson, the deep and unshakable poise that would one day let her stand among duchesses as an equal. She belonged and did not belong. All at once, a poor man's daughter in a queen's nursery, and that doubleness, that lifelong sense of moving with ease through a world she had not been born to, was the first and the most lasting gift the queen's household gave her. Of her earliest years we know very little, for she was no one of importance then, only a poor knight's child, and the chroniclers who would later fill pages with her did not trouble to record the birth of a Hainaulter girl. And here we must be honest about the nature of what we can know of a woman like Catherine, for it shapes the whole way her story must be told. The records of that distant age are thin and uneven, kept by men for men's purposes, recording wars and successions and the deeds of the great, and a woman, even a duchess, slips through the gaps of such records, glimpsed only here and there, in a grant of lands, a mention in an account book, the venom of a disapproving chronicler. Of Catherine's own voice we have almost nothing, no letters in her hand, no record of her thoughts, no account of how she felt through the great turns of her life, the love and the scandal and the renunciation and the triumph. We see her from the outside, in the bare facts of what was done to her and around her, and occasionally by her, and we must reconstruct the inner woman from the shape of her actions, from the choices she made and held to across the years. What we have, in place of her letters and her voice, are the dry records of her age, the grants and the account books and the legal documents in which her name appears. And there is a strange poignancy in reading the story of a deep love through such cold and practical traces. We have no love letter from the Duke to Catherine, no tender word in either of their hands, nothing of the warmth that surely passed between them across the decades. What we have instead is the record of his gifts, the lands granted, the monies paid, the wardships bestowed, the careful provisions set down by clerks in the accounts of a grand estate. And it is in these, oddly, that we must read the love. For the gifts are the love made visible, the steady material care that speaks where no words survive. When we see, year after year, the Duke providing for Catherine, advancing her children, keeping her in comfort even through the years of public separation, we are reading, in the only language that has come down to us, the long faithfulness of his heart. Written, not in poetry, but in property, in the patient, unbroken record of a man taking care of the woman he loved. It is a humbling thing to reconstruct one of the great love stories of the age from the entries of an account book, but it is what we have, and there is a truth in it too. That love is shown as much in the steady provision across the years as in any fine words, and that the dry records of the Duke's open care for Catherine are, in their way, the truest love letters that survive between them. It is a kind of portrait painted from shadows, and we should hold it humbly, knowing how much of her is lost to us, how much we are guessing at when we speak of her love, or her endurance, or her dignity. And yet the shape of her life speaks clearly enough, even through the silence. For actions tell their own tale, and a woman who loved one man for a quarter of a century through scandal and separation, who bore the world's contempt without breaking, and was raised to a duchess at the last, has told us, by the very shape of her life, a great deal about the kind of woman she was, even if her own voice is lost to us forever. She was born, most likely, across the sea in her father's country, around the middle of the century, and brought to England as a small child. Her father, Sir Pound de Roet, had come into England in the train of the Queen, one of those Hainaulters who had attached their fortunes to Philippa's, and he served as a herald and a knight. An honourable man of modest means with a name but no great lands. The county of Hainault, where Catherine's people came from, was a small but cultured land in the Low Countries, part of that rich and busy region of trading towns and chivalric courts that lay across the narrow sea from England, and its connection to the English crown ran through the Queen herself, who had brought a whole train of her countrymen with her when she came to marry the king. Catherine's father served as a herald, and the office of herald was a curious and an honourable one in that age, for heralds were the keepers of the whole law of chivalry, the men who knew every coat of arms and every noble lineage, who carried challenges and messages between lords and armies, whose persons were held sacred even in war, who proclaimed the great tournaments and recorded the deeds of the brave. To be a herald was to live at the very heart of the chivalric world, to know intimately the families and the honours and the bloodlines of the great. And it is fitting that the daughter of a herald, raised among the law of noble descent, should herself become the founder of one of the most consequential bloodlines in English history. Her father was no rich man, and he died, it seems, while his children were still young, which is why they were taken into the Queen's household to be raised. But he had given them a name and a connection and a place, however modest, in the world of the great. And from that small foothold, the daughter of a foreign herald living on a queen's charity, Catherine would climb to a height her father could never have dreamed of, and found a line that would wear the crown his heraldry had served. There is a particular poignancy in the fact that Catherine began as a foreigner, a Hainaulter child in a strange land, for her whole rise is in a sense the story of an outsider made wholly, deeply English. She came from across the sea, of foreign blood and foreign birth, brought to England as a small girl on the fortunes of a foreign queen, and yet she would become not merely an English duchess, but the ancestress of the English royal line itself, her foreign blood flowing into the very heart of the nation's monarchy. It was not so unusual in truth, for the noble families of England were threaded through with foreign blood. The kings themselves descended from Normans and Angevins, and married to princesses from every corner of Europe, and a small influx of Hainaulters in a queen's train was nothing remarkable. But there is still something striking in the journey of this particular foreign girl, from the margins of the court, where she lived on charity, to the summit of the realm and the root of its future kings, the outsider who became, through love and endurance, more central to the English story than almost any native-born woman of her age. She was made by England, raised and married and ennobled within it, and she repaid it, in a sense, by becoming the source of so much of its royalty, the Hainaulter herald's daughter at the head of the English royal tree. The foreign child living on a queen's kindness had become, by the end, as English as the crown itself, and more, its ancestress. And there is a quiet beauty in that. The outsider, not merely admitted, but woven into the very bloodline of the nation that had taken her in. He had several children, and Catherine was one of the younger, with an elder sister named Philippa, after the Queen perhaps, and the two girls were placed together in the royal household to be raised. It was the making of them. For a poor knight to have his daughters taken into the household of the Queen was the greatest of gifts, for there they would be fed and clothed and taught, given the bearing and the accomplishments of the court, and married in time, far better than their father's purse could ever have managed. Catherine grew up then, not in poverty and not in grandeur, but in the strange, in-between world of the well-born poor who lived upon the kindness of the great, raised among princes on a knight's charity, learning early the lesson that would shape her life: how to move with grace and dignity through a world that was not quite her own. Her whole life would be lived along the seams of the rigid social order of her age, and it is worth understanding how steep and how fixed that order was, for it makes her rise the more astonishing. Medieval society was imagined as a great ladder ordained by God, every soul set in its appointed rung, from the labourer in the field at the bottom, up through the ranks of yeomen and gentry and knights and lords to the king at the summit. And the whole weight of custom and law and religion held each person in their place, for to be discontented with one's station was very nearly to quarrel with the order of heaven. A person was born to their rank and expected to die in it. The gulfs between the ranks were vast and seldom crossed, and the idea that a knight's daughter might rise to be a duchess of the blood royal was so far outside the ordinary run of things as to be almost unthinkable. Catherine lived her life moving between the rungs of that ladder, born low but raised among the high. A poor girl with the polish of a court, a knight's wife who served duchesses, a mistress who was neither servant nor lady, and at the last, a duchess who had been born almost nothing. She crossed, in the course of her single life, gulfs that the order of her age held to be all but uncrossable, and she did it not by rebellion or scheming, but by the slow working of love and circumstance, and her own quiet excellence, until the rigid ladder that should have held her near its foot had carried her, against all its own rules, very nearly to its top. The household that raised her was a school such as no other in the land, for the court of Edward and Philippa was the centre of the kingdom, the fountain of all honour and fashion and refinement. And a girl brought up in the Queen's own rooms was given a polish that money alone could never buy. The England of Catherine's girlhood was near the height of a long and a glorious reign, for the old King Edward had ruled for many years and led his armies to famous victories across the sea, and his court was the most brilliant in the land, a place of tournaments and feasts and the high ceremonies of chivalry, the Queen Philippa beloved at its centre. But Catherine would live long enough to see that golden age fade and darken, as all such ages do, for the old king grew into a sad dotage in his last years, his beloved queen dying before him, his glories slipping away, the great victories turning to defeats, the realm falling into discontent and faction. And after him came his grandson, a boy king, young Richard, clever and willful and ill-fated, under whom the kingdom would slide toward the crisis that broke at last in the deposing of that same king by the Duke's own son. Catherine lived through the whole of this arc, from the bright noon of the old king's reign through its sad decline and into the troubled reign that followed. A span of decades that saw the world of her childhood pass away, and a new and more dangerous age come on. It is part of the scale of her story, this immense length of time it covered, for she was no figure of a single dramatic moment, but a woman whose life stretched across half a century and more of English history, through the rise and the fall of a glorious reign, and into the storms of the next, enduring, all the while, through her own private drama of love and scandal and triumph, set against the vast changing backdrop of the age. There is a quiet, remarkable fact about Catherine's life that is easy to miss, which is that she lived peaceably through one of the most violent and dangerous ages in English history and came through it whole. Her years saw the terrible plague return again and again, the great rising of the common people that burned the Savoy and murdered lords in the streets, the bitter quarrels of the nobility, the deposing of a king, the founding of a new royal house in blood and usurpation, the first dark gatherings of the storm that would become, after her death, the long civil wars. It was an age of sudden death and sudden reversal of violence high and low, and many who lived through it, lords and ladies and commons alike, were swept away by it, killed or ruined or broken on the wheel of those dangerous times. And through all of it, Catherine moved quietly, neither a maker of the violence, nor, in the end, a victim of it, holding to her own life and her own love through the storms that destroyed so many around her, and dying at last in her bed, an honoured duchess, in the peace of her cathedral city. There is a kind of wisdom in that, the wisdom of those who keep their heads down and hold to what matters, and let the great violent dramas of the powerful pass over them. And Catherine, for all the drama of her private life, had that wisdom, surviving by patience and discretion, an age that cut down the bold and the proud. She was a still point, in a way, in a turning violent world, and she outlasted much that seemed far mightier than she, the quiet woman enduring, while the storms raged and passed. She learned the languages of the court, the French that the nobility spoke among themselves, and the English of the common people, and perhaps the Latin of the church and the clerks. She learned to read and to write, accomplishments that many a noble lady never mastered, and that would mark her all her life as a woman of education. Learning was a rare and a precious thing for a woman in that age, and Catherine's possession of it set her apart in ways that mattered through the whole of her life. Many great ladies, born to far higher rank than she, could not read at all, or could read only haltingly, for the education of women was thought a small matter, and a noble woman was valued for her blood and her breeding and her childbearing rather than for her learning. Catherine, raised in the cultivated household of a queen who valued such things, was given an education that many a countess lacked, the ability to read and perhaps to write, to follow the offices of the church from a book, to manage correspondence and accounts, to move with understanding in a world of words and records. It was the kind of accomplishment that quietly increased a woman's competence and her consequence, that made her more able to manage her own affairs, more useful to those she served, more capable of holding her own in the practical business of a noble household or a landed estate. And it connected her too, to the literary flowering of her age, to the world of her brother-in-law, the poet, to the books and the learning that were beginning to spread among the laity. We should picture Catherine then, not as an ornament merely, but as a capable and a literate woman, able to read her psalter and keep her accounts and understand the documents that governed her life. An education that was part of the foundation of her lifelong competence, the practical underpinning beneath the romance of her story, the learned poor girl whose learning was one more of the quiet strengths that carried her so far. She learned the fine needlework, the music, the dancing, the management of a mighty household, the soft and careful arts by which a noblewoman ordered the world around her. And she learned, above all, the manners of greatness, how to carry herself among the high, how to be at ease in the presence of dukes and queens, how to be useful and graceful and quietly indispensable, so that by the time she was grown, she had the bearing of a great lady, though she had none of the blood or the lands of one. It was this early steeping in the ways of the court, that would let her, in time, step into the highest places in the land, as though she had been born to them. For in every way that could be taught, she had. The accomplishments she gathered in those years were not the idle ornaments we might imagine, but the working tools of a noble woman's life, each of them a real and a useful skill. To read and write was to be able to manage estates and conduct correspondence, and follow the devotions of the church from a book of hours, and it set its possessor apart, for literacy was far from universal, even among the great, and a woman who had it was valued. The fine needlework was not mere decoration, but the production of precious things, the embroidered hangings and vestments and garments that were among the treasures of a household. The skill in music and dancing was the currency of courtly society, the way one shone at the great gatherings where reputations and matches were made. And the deepest skill of all, the management of a vast household, was a whole science in itself, the ordering of dozens or hundreds of servants, the keeping of accounts, the provisioning of a moving court, the quiet exercise of authority that kept a noble establishment running. All of this Catherine learned thoroughly and well in the Queen's household, so that when at last she was raised to command households of her own, she did it with the practiced ease of a woman who had been trained for it from childhood. The court had made her, long before any duke noticed her, into exactly the kind of woman who could one day be a duchess, and it is one of the quiet ironies of her story that the very excellence of her upbringing, case to make her a good knight's wife, had fitted her instead for a destiny no one had planned. Her sister Philippa, raised beside her, would marry a man named Geoffrey Chaucer, a clerk and a poet in the royal service, the man who would become the greatest poet of the English tongue. And so Catherine would grow up sister by marriage to the father of English poetry, one more thread binding her quiet life to the great names of her age. It is worth lingering on that connection, for it places Catherine at the very heart of the golden age of early English culture. Geoffrey Chaucer, who married her sister, was no mere clerk, but the man who, more than any other, made English a language fit for sweeping poetry, who took the rough speech of the common people and wrought from it verse of such richness and humour and humanity that it has never since been bettered. The father of English literature, whose tales of pilgrims on the road to Canterbury are read and loved to this day. And he was Catherine's brother by marriage, a member of her own family circle, moving in the same royal service, attached to the same grand household of Lancaster that would shape her life. The two sisters, the poor daughters of a Hainaulter knight, had between them married, or would come to be bound to, the two most remarkable men of their age in their separate spheres, the one to the greatest poet of the English tongue, the other to the greatest prince of the English realm. They moved, these dear sisters, in an extraordinary company, the makers of English poetry and the wielders of English power, and Catherine's life was woven, through her sister and her own destiny alike, into the very fabric of the age that was shaping the England to come. The poet who sang of love and the woman who lived one of the great loves of the century were kin, seated perhaps at the same tables, present at the same occasions, and there is something fitting in that. That the woman whose love story would outlast 600 years should have had, for a brother, the man who taught the English language how to sing of love. Catherine lived through a quiet revolution in the very speech of her country, and it is worth noticing, for it marks her age as a turning point in the making of England. When she was a girl, the language of the court and the law and the great was still largely French, the tongue the ruling class had spoken since the Norman conquest 3 centuries before, while English was the rough speech of the common people, looked down upon as unfit for high matters. But across her lifetime this began to change, English rising from the mouths of the people into the halls of the great, into the law, into literature, until by the end of her life it was becoming, once more, the language of the whole nation, high and low alike. And her own brother-in-law, the poet, was at the very heart of that change, for by choosing to write his vast poems in English rather than in French or Latin, by showing that the despised common tongue could carry verse of the highest beauty and wit, he did as much as any one person to make English a language fit for greatness, to lift it from the kitchen to the court. So Catherine's age was the age in which England, in a sense, found its own voice again, in which the nation's own language rose to claim its place, and she lived through it, kin to the very man who led the change. There is a fittingness in that, for her own story, the rise of the low to the high, the despised made worthy, is in its way the same story as the rise of the English tongue itself, the common thing proving, against all the scorn of the proud, that it was capable of the highest greatness. The language of the people rose to wear the crown of literature in the very years that the herald's daughter rose to wear the coronet of a duchess. And both risings, the public one and the immense private one, belong to the same turning age. The age in which the England we would recognise was quietly being born. In the way of her world, a girl raised in the Queen's household was married off when she came of age to a suitable man, and for Catherine the match that was found was a knight of Lincolnshire named Sir Hugh Swynford. He was no powerful lord, a knight of modest estate, holding the manors of Kettlethorpe and Colby in the flat fenland country of Lincolnshire. A fighting man who would spend much of his short married life away on campaign in the wars in France. The wars in France were the vast backdrop to the whole of Catherine's age, the long and grinding conflict between the crowns of England and France that ran on, with truces and renewals, down generation after generation, a war that shaped every noble family in the land. The knights and lords of England spent much of their lives upon campaign over the sea, fighting in the great chevauchés that rode through the French countryside, besieging towns, garrisoning conquered places, seeking the plunder and the ransoms and the glory that war could bring. And a knight like Hugh Swynford would have expected to spend a large part of his life so engaged, leaving his wife to manage his lands at home. The Duke himself, the man Catherine would come to love, was one of the leading commanders of that war, leading army after army over the sea in the long English effort to hold and extend the conquests of his father's reign. And it was on one of these campaigns, in the Duke's own service, that Hugh Swynford fell sick and died, far from his fenland home. So the war that defined the age touched Catherine's life directly, taking her husband from her and making her a widow, and it shaped the age in which she lived. A world of men forever going away to fight across the sea, and women forever holding things together at home, of glory and plunder abroad and management and waiting at home, of the constant comings and goings of a nobility, half of whose life was spent at war. It is part of the texture of her time that we must feel, this endless distant war, the absences and the dangers and the deaths it brought, the way it shaped the rhythm of noble marriages and the fortunes of noble families, and the way it played its part by widowing her young in setting Catherine upon the strange road her life would take. It was a respectable match for a poor knight's daughter, neither high nor low, and Catherine went from the warmth and the splendour of the royal court to the muddy reality of a minor knight's manor, a world away from the Queen's painted chambers. This first marriage of hers was the ordinary kind of match her age made, and it is worth setting it beside the extraordinary marriage that would crown her life, for the contrast tells us much. The marriage to Hugh Swynford was arranged, as marriages were, for suitability rather than for love, a sensible joining of a well-raised but poor young woman to a knight of modest estate who needed a capable wife to manage his lands. And whatever affection grew between them, it was not the reason for the match. It was the kind of marriage that the overwhelming majority of people made in that age, practical, arranged, a matter of property and family and the ordering of life rather than of the heart, and Catherine accepted it as women did, and did her duty by it, bearing her husband's children and keeping his house through his long absences. That was marriage as her world understood it, a contract and an arrangement, and had her life run its ordinary course, it would have been the only marriage she ever knew. The wonder of her story is that she was granted at the very end the other kind of marriage, the sort her world scarcely believed in, the marriage made for love alone, and that the second husband was no knight of modest estate, but the greatest prince in the land. To have known both, the ordinary arranged match of her youth and the extraordinary love match of her age, is itself a mark of how far outside the common run her life was carried, and it lets us measure by the distance between her two weddings the whole vast arc of her rise, from the practical bride at the Fenland Manor to the beloved Duchess in the blazing cathedral. Kettlethorpe was no palace but a working manor in damp and difficult country, prone to flooding its lands, hard to manage, and there the young wife kept her husband's house and bore his children while he was away at the wars. The Lincolnshire she came to was a flat, wide, watery country, a land of fens and marshes and slow brown rivers, of wide skies and reedy meres, very different from the painted chambers of the court where she had been raised. It was rich farming land where it could be drained and worked, but it was hard country too, forever threatened by flood. The fields won from the water by constant labour and as constantly reclaimed by it. And the manor of Kettlethorpe was no great estate, but a modest holding that took careful management to keep in good heart. Here Catherine learned the other half of a noblewoman's life. Not the courtly graces of the Queen's household, but the practical hard work of running a working manor, overseeing the farm and the servants and the accounts, managing the estate in her husband's long absences, holding it all together for the inheritance of her young son. It was lonely work, very likely, for a woman raised in the warmth and bustle of the court, set down now in a quiet fenland manor, with her husband away at the wars for months and years at a time. Her company, her children and her servants, and the slow round of the country seasons. The medieval year had a rhythm we have largely lost, a great wheel of seasons and feasts that turned the same way for the Duchess and the labourer alike, and Catherine's life, lived between court and country, was shaped by it as every life then was. There was the dead cold of winter, the short dark days, and the long nights. The world shut down to its firesides, the high feast of Christmas, blazing in the midst of it with 12 days of festivity. Light and warmth and plenty held up in defiance of the dark of winter. There was the slow awakening of spring, the lengthening days, the high holy season of Easter after the solemn fast of Lent, the land greening and the work of the fields beginning again. There was the fullness of summer, the long light evenings, the labour of the growing season, the journeys made easier by the dry roads and the warm weather. And there was the autumn, the harvest brought in, the slaughter and salting against the coming cold, the year turning down again toward the dark. Round and round it went, this turning wheel of the year, marked by the feasts of the church and the labours of the land, the same for the high and the low, and Catherine lived her whole life within its turning. The Christmases in the great halls, the holy seasons in the cathedral close, the slow country year at her fenland manor. It is part of the texture of her age, this deep rhythm of time, so different from our own restless and lit-up age, and to imagine her life truly is, to set it within that turning wheel of dark and light, fast and feast. The medieval year, going round and round beneath the wide English sky. But it taught her things the court could not. The management of land and money and people in the hard practical sphere, the patience and the self-reliance of a woman who must hold her own house together alone. And it gave her, too, a foothold of her own in the world, a place that was hers, the Swynford manors that she would hold and manage through all the changes of her life. The one solid possession of a woman whose fortunes otherwise rose and fell with the love of a prince. She had a son, named Thomas, who would carry on the Swynford name, and serve faithfully the family his mother would one day join, and a daughter, named Blanche, and perhaps others who did not live. The phrase, others who did not live, carries a weight that we should not pass over too quickly, for it points to one of the hardest realities of Catherine's age, the terrible toll that childbearing took on women and children alike. To be a wife in that age was to bear child after child, with little respite through the whole of one's fertile years, for there was no reliable way to do otherwise, and each childbirth was a danger to the mother's life. Attended by no medicine we would recognize in conditions that killed a frightful number of women in the bearing, and of the children who were born, a great many did not survive infancy, carried off by the fevers and the agues and the plagues that swept through a world without any understanding of how disease spread. So that a mother might bear 6 or 8 or 10 children and see half of them buried before they were grown. This was the common lot of women, the great unspoken labour and grief of their lives, the constant cycle of pregnancy and birth, and, so often, the small graves that followed, born again and again across a lifetime. Catherine lived through all of this, bearing children to two men across her years, knowing the dangers of the birthing chamber and very likely the grief of the small graves. And it is part of the hidden texture of her story. As of every woman's story in that age, this relentless and dangerous business of bringing children into a world that took so many of them back. That her own surviving children should have risen so high, an earl and a cardinal and a duke and the ancestress of kings, is the more remarkable set against the ordinary toll of her time. The bright exception to a world in which so much of motherhood was loss. It was an ordinary beginning to an extraordinary life, the kind of life thousands of knights' wives lived and died in unremembered, managing a household, raising children, waiting for a husband away at war, and had nothing more befallen her. That is the life Catherine would have lived to the end, a Fenland knight's widow, a name in no chronicle at all. But Catherine did not stay only at Kettlethorpe, for her connections to the court did not end with her marriage, and it was these that drew her into the orbit of the family that would become her destiny, the House of Lancaster. For the greatest prince in England, after the king himself and his eldest son, was John, the Duke of Lancaster, a younger son of King Edward, who had married the heiress of Lancaster and become through her the richest and most powerful nobleman in the realm. The wealth and the power of the House of Lancaster in those years are hard to overstate, for the Duke held lands and castles across the length and breadth of England and beyond a private dominion within the kingdom, with thousands of men wearing his livery and a household that rivaled the king's own in its splendour. His chief residence in the capital was the Savoy, a vast and magnificent palace on the river between the city and Westminster, the most splendid private house in all of England, filled with treasures, hung with tapestries and gold, a place of such richness that it was a wonder of the age. To have lived within that splendour, even as a servant in it, was to know a magnificence that few in the whole kingdom would ever glimpse, and it formed the backdrop to much of Catherine's life before the burning. The high houses of the Duke were filled with treasures gathered from across the known world, vessels of gold and silver upon the tables, hangings of rich cloth upon the walls, furs and silks and jewels, the trappings of a prince who lived in greater state than many a king. The food at his tables was lavish and various, brought from his own estates and from far countries, spiced and dressed, and presented with ceremony. The company was the highest in the land, lords and knights and ladies, churchmen and envoys and poets, all gathered about the magnificent Duke, and the whole establishment moved and breathed with a stately grandeur that was the very image of earthly greatness. Catherine lived within this realm, near its heart, through the long years of her service and her love, and though she had been raised in the Queen's household, and was no stranger to greatness, the splendour of Lancaster was a thing apart even from that. And when the rebels burned the Savoy and ground its treasures to dust, they destroyed not merely a building, but the visible centre of this whole magnificent realm, the gathered glory of the greatest private house in the land, much of which Catherine herself had known and moved among. The splendour she had lived within was like everything else in her uncertain age, a fragile thing that could be raised across generations and thrown down in a single day of fire, and she had seen both, the glory and its burning, in the course of her long and changeful life. To serve in the household of such a prince was to live at the very summit of the private sphere, in surroundings of a magnificence that few in the kingdom would ever see. And to be near the Duke was to be near a man who was, in all but name, a king, the dominant figure in the government of the realm through the long decline of his aging father and the troubled reign of his young nephew that followed. This was the world Catherine entered when she came into the service of the Duke's wife, a world of almost royal grandeur, and though she entered it as a servant, a gentlewoman in the Duchess's train, she entered the household that would become, in time, her own, the great House of Lancaster, whose name she would one day bear. The daily life of such a household had a rhythm and a texture all its own, and Catherine lived within it for the greater part of her life. A great noble household was not fixed in one place, but moved through the year from castle to castle and manor to manor. For a lord held estates scattered across the kingdom, and travelled among them to consume their produce and to show himself to his tenants. So that life was a constant packing and unpacking. The whole vast establishment of servants and goods and furnishings rolling along the roads from one residence to the next. Travel itself, in that age, was a slow and a laborious and a sometimes dangerous business, and it shaped the rhythm of every life that moved at all. The roads were poor, often little more than rutted tracks that turned to mud in the wet and to dust in the dry, winding through a countryside of forest and field and fen, where a traveller might go for miles between villages. A noble household on the move was a small army, its carts and pack horses and riders strung out along the road, carrying everything from the lord's bed to his account books to the very hangings of his chambers. For a lord took his comforts with him from house to house. A journey of a few score miles might take days, the company halting at religious houses or at the lord's own manors along the way, and the going was at the pace of the slowest cart through whatever weather came. For Catherine, whose life was lived between the court and the country, between the great houses of Lancaster and her own fenland manor, and the cathedral city of Lincoln, this slow travel was a constant feature of her years. The long days on the road between one world and another, the river of the household winding through the English countryside. It is a thing we should hold in mind as we follow her from place to place across her life, that every move was a labour, every journey a slow passage through a wide and quiet land, and that the England she crossed and recrossed was a green and empty country of small villages and great forests and slow rivers, travelled at the pace of a walking horse. Where to go from one's home to the court was to undertake a real journey through a real and a sometimes perilous world. Within it the days had their settled order, the early rising and the hearing of mass, the business of the morning, the great meal of the day taken in the hall, with the household gathered according to its careful ranks. The lord and his family at the high table on the dais. The rest ranged below in strict order of precedence. There was the work of managing the estates and the accounts, the receiving of guests and petitioners, the devotions of the church marking the hours, and in the evenings the entertainments, the music and the dancing, and the telling of tales. The warmth of a gathered company against the dark. Picture one of those evenings in the great hall of a ducal residence, for it is the kind of scene Catherine knew through the whole of her life, first as a child, then as a servant, and at the last as the lady at the high table. The hall is long and high, its roof lost in shadow above, the walls hung with rich tapestries that stir a little in the draughts, and down its length the broad fire burns in the central hearth or the wide chimney, throwing its red light over the gathered company. The tables are laid with the meal, the bread and the meats and the wine, brought in by a procession of servants in the lord's livery, and the household sits ranged in its careful order, the great at the high table on the dais, the rest below according to their rank. Scores of faces in the firelight, and the smoking light of the candles and the rushlights. There is the noise of many people at meat, the talk and the laughter. And then, as the eating gives way to the evening, the entertainments, a minstrel with a harp, a song, perhaps dancing in the cleared space, the telling of a tale, the warmth and the company and the light held close against the vast cold dark that pressed in upon every medieval night. The dark of a world without any light but flame. It was in such halls, in such firelit evenings, that Catherine's life was largely lived, the gathered warmth of the mighty household against the dark, and it is fitting that we should follow her story on just such a night as those, in the quiet and the dark, with the warmth gathered close, as so many of her own evenings must have been. It was a crowded, busy, intimate world, hundreds of people living in close company, knowing one another's business, bound together in the service of the foremost family at the centre, and Catherine knew it from every angle across her life. First as a child in the Queen's household, then as a gentlewoman in the Duchess's train, then as the governess of the children, and at the last as the lady of it all, the Duchess at the high table, mistress of the very household she had entered, long before, as a servant. The poor knight's widow from the Fenland manor was moving, step by quiet step, into the most splendid orbit in the kingdom, and though she could not have known where it would lead, she was already, by entering that household, set upon the road that would carry her to its summit. And the Duke's wife, his first Duchess, was a lady named Blanche, the heiress of all the Lancaster lands, famed through the whole kingdom for her beauty and her gentleness and her goodness, a woman so lovely that the poets sang of her, Catherine's own brother-in-law Chaucer among them. Into the household of this radiant Duchess Catherine was brought, as one of her attendants, one of the gentlewomen who waited upon the great lady, and so she passed from the small sphere of her Lincolnshire manor into the dazzling household of the House of Lancaster, the grandest private court in England. The world she lived in, day to day, was very much a world of women, for a proud lady was surrounded by a little court of her own, her gentlewomen, and her damsels and her chamber women, who attended her person, shared her rooms, ordered her clothes and her jewels, kept her company through the long hours, and lived in the closest intimacy with one another and with their mistress. It was within this female sphere, the inner household of the Duchess, that Catherine spent her years of service, one of the women about the noble lady, woven into the daily companionship of that small society of waiting women, with its own friendships and rivalries and confidences, its shared labour and shared leisure, its closeness. These were the women among whom Catherine lived and worked, who knew her best in her years of service, who saw the love grow and kept, or did not keep it secret, who were the daily companions of her strange and rising life. And in time, the wheel would turn until Catherine herself was the noble lady at the centre of such a household, with her own gentlewomen about her. The served become the mistress, the woman who had waited on a duchess become a duchess waited upon. It is a world largely lost to us, this intimate female society at the heart of every vast household, scarcely recorded by the chroniclers who cared only for the doings of men, but it was the daily texture of Catherine's life for many years. The company of women among whom she lived, her long quiet service before her great elevation, and we should remember it as we follow her, the warmth and the closeness of that hidden female world within the splendour of the House of Lancaster. She served the lovely Blanche and won her trust and her affection, and she came to know, in the ordinary way of a servant in a great household, the Duchess's husband, the proud and magnificent Duke, never dreaming what he would one day become to her. The lady she served, the Duchess Blanche, deserves to be remembered in her own right, for she was one of the most admired women of her age. And Catherine's years in her service shaped everything that came after. Blanche was the heiress of the whole vast inheritance of Lancaster, and through her the Duke had gained all his greatness. But she was loved not for her lands, but for herself. Famed throughout the kingdom for a beauty and a sweetness and a goodness that seemed almost more than earthly. She was, by every account, fair-haired and lovely, gentle and kind and devout, the very image of what a noble lady should be. And when she died young, the whole court mourned her, and the poets made her immortal. Catherine served this radiant lady closely in the intimate daily way of a trusted gentlewoman, helping to order her household, attending her person, sharing the rhythms of her days, and she won by the signs the Duchess's real affection and trust, for she was given, after Blanche's death, the care of the Duchess's own children, which is not a charge one gives to a servant one does not love. So Catherine came to know the House of Lancaster first through its lovely lady, served her well, earned her trust, and learned in her household the ways of the very greatest rank of all. And there is a poignancy in it, looking back, that the gentle Blanche, whom Catherine served so faithfully, was the first of the Duke's loves, as Catherine would be the last. The two women bound across the years by the same man and the same mighty house, the radiant Duchess of his youth and the enduring love of his age, with Catherine, for a time, the devoted servant of the woman whose place she would one day, in part, come to fill. For now she was only a trusted gentlewoman in the Duchess's train, a knight's wife earning her place, moving quietly through the edges of greatness as she had done all her life. But she had entered the house that would make her, and nothing after this would be ordinary again. Then sorrow came to the house of Lancaster, for the lovely Blanche died young, carried off in the prime of her life, leaving the proud Duke a widower with his small children and a grief that the poets recorded forever, for it was to console the Duke in his mourning that Chaucer wrote one of his earliest and most touching poems, a lament for the good and beautiful lady who had died. Death came easily and often in Catherine's world, and it is part of the texture of her age that we must feel if we are to understand it. She lived in the shadow of the great pestilence, the terrible plague that had swept through England a few years before her marriage and would return again and again throughout her life, carrying off a third or more of the whole population in its first dreadful visitation, emptying villages, filling graveyards, striking down the great and the humble alike, with a swiftness that left the living stunned. It was a world in which death was never far, in which a person hale in the morning might be dead by night, in which no rank or wealth or youth was any protection, and the lovely Blanche, for all her greatness, was very likely one of its countless victims, struck down in her prime as so many were. People lived, in that age, with a closeness to death that we can scarcely imagine, burying their children, losing their partners young, marrying again and again as plague and childbirth and the ordinary violence of the time thinned their households. Catherine herself would lose her husband young, and the Duke would lose 2 wives before he married her, and all of it was the common lot of an age in which life was fragile and short, and death was a familiar visitor. To live, in such a world, was to hold what you loved lightly, knowing it might be taken at any moment, and there is something in Catherine's long, patient love, held fast across decades of uncertainty and loss, that speaks of a woman who had learned, in a world of sudden death, the rare strength of holding fast to one thing through everything. The Duke was heartbroken by every account for whatever else he was, and he was an ambitious and a worldly man. He had truly loved his radiant first wife, and her death left a wound in him and a gap at the heart of his household. 3 young children, motherless, the lovely lady gone. And into that gap stepped Catherine, for she was already trusted in the household, educated, capable, gentle, a mother herself, and she was given the care of the Duke's daughters, the little girls Philippa and Elizabeth of Lancaster, becoming their governess, the woman who would raise the motherless daughters of the greatest prince in England. The position of governess in a grand household was one of real trust and real intimacy, far more than the word might suggest to us. For the woman who raised the children of a prince held in her hands the shaping of the next generation of the great. She was responsible for the daughters' upbringing, their manners and their learning and their moral formation, the instilling in them of all the accomplishments and the bearing that Catherine herself had absorbed long ago in the Queen's household. And she lived in the closest daily contact with them, a constant presence, through the years of their growing, more present, very often, than their own great parents, who were forever occupied with the affairs of the realm. To do it well, as Catherine plainly did, was to win the love of the children and the trust of their father, to become a fixture of the household, woven into its daily life, indispensable and dear. And it placed her, of course, in the constant presence of the Duke, for the children were his, and their upbringing his concern, and the governess of his daughters was a woman he would see often, consult, come to know well, come to rely upon. It was through this intimate daily service, this years-long closeness in the heart of his household, that the bond between Catherine and the Duke had room to grow, not as a sudden spark, but as the slow deepening of a familiar trust into something more. The daughters she raised loved her, by every sign, for one of them named a child of her own after Catherine in the years to come. A small, quiet testimony across the centuries to the affection in which the governess was held. And in raising the Duke's children, Catherine wove herself so deeply into the fabric of the House of Lancaster that in the end she became its lady, the servant of its children, grown into the mistress of them all. It was a position of trust and honour, and Catherine filled it well, by all the signs, for the daughters she raised grew to love her, and one of them, in later years, would name her own child after the woman who had been her governess. The two girls Catherine raised, the Duke's daughters by the lovely Blanche, went on to lives as glittering as any in the age. And the fact that the woman who shaped them was Catherine is a quiet measure of how high she stood in the trust of the House of Lancaster, even in her years as a servant in it. The elder daughter, Philippa of Lancaster, would be married to the King of Portugal and become a queen, a famous and a much-loved queen in her adopted land, the mother of a brilliant brood of royal princes, remembered as one of the great generations of that kingdom's history. The younger, Elizabeth of Lancaster, would marry into the high nobility of England and live a life of rank and consequence at the heart of the realm. So the governess who raised them, the poor knight's widow, Katherine Swynford, had shaped the upbringing of a future queen and a high lady, instilling in them, in the years of their motherless girlhood, the manners and the learning and the bearing she had absorbed long before in the household of a queen herself. It is a thread that runs all through her story, this passing on of the arts of greatness. For Catherine had been made by the Queen's household into a woman fit to move among the great. And she in turn made the Duke's daughters into women fit to be queens and great ladies. And the love those daughters bore her, shown in the naming of a grandchild after her, is a small bright testimony to the woman she was. Trusted with the most precious charge a high house could give, the raising of its daughters, and fulfilling it so well that she was loved for it across the generations. So Catherine, the poor knight's daughter, became the keeper and the teacher of princesses, raising the Duke's children as she had been raised herself in the warmth of a noble household, and drawing, day by day, closer to the heart of the family she served. And then her own husband died. Sir Hugh Swynford, away on campaign in the Duke's service in the wars across the sea, fell sick and died there, far from home, leaving Catherine a widow while she was still young, with her own small children and her place in the ducal household. It was a hard blow, for a widow's position in that world was precarious, dependent on the goodwill of the great and the management of her late husband's modest lands. And Catherine now had to hold together the Swynford manors for her young son's inheritance, while keeping her place at the side of the Duke's daughters. Widowhood was a strange and a double-edged estate for a woman in that age, at once a danger, sometimes a rare kind of freedom. On the one hand, a widow lost the protection and the standing that her husband gave, and might find herself vulnerable, her lands coveted by greedy neighbours, her position precarious, her future uncertain, dependent on the goodwill of the powerful and the careful management of whatever her husband had left. On the other hand, a widow was, for perhaps the only time in her life, a woman in her own right. No longer under the authority of a father or a husband, able to hold property in her own name, to manage her own affairs, to make her own choices in a way that neither maid nor wife could do. Catherine knew both faces of widowhood across her life, for she was widowed twice young from her knight and old from her duke, and both times she had to find her footing as a woman alone, holding her own lands, ordering her own life, depending on no man's authority, but managing under no man's protection either. It was in her first widowhood, the young widowhood after Hugh Swynford's death, that her life took its grand turn, for it was as a widow, free and unattached, and her own woman, that she was open to the love that came to her. Neither a maid to be guarded, nor a wife bound to another. There is a sense in which her whole extraordinary story was made possible by the freedoms and the dangers of widowhood. That estate in which a woman of her age came nearest to standing on her own, and Katherine, twice a widow, lived much of her consequential life in exactly that precarious independent space. But she was not cast adrift, for the House of Lancaster did not abandon those who served it, and the Duke himself took care that his daughter's governess, the widow of one of his own knights, should be provided for, her son's wardship protected, her position secure. So she remained, the young widow, in the heart of the ducal household, raising the Duke's daughters, managing her own affairs, a woman alone now, but valued and trusted and close, very close, to the proud and recently widowed prince whose children she was raising. Two people who had both lost the partners of their youth, thrown together daily in the intimacy of a mighty household, the grieving Duke and the gentle governess. And what grew between them in those years was the thing that would change both their lives, and echo down the centuries after them. There must have been a moment, though no record of it survives, and none ever could, when the thing between them changed. When the familiar warmth of a trusted servant and a grateful master deepened into something neither could any longer mistake for ordinary affection. We cannot know how it came, whether slowly across many small moments or in some single turning, a look held too long, a word that said more than it meant, the sudden knowledge in each of them of what had been quietly growing. But we know it came, and we know what it cost and what it meant, and there is something moving in the thought of it. These two people, the lonely widowed prince and the gentle widowed governess, discovering in the daily intimacy of a great household that they had come to love each other, and facing, in that discovery, the whole weight of everything that stood against it, his marriage, her honour, the law of the church, the judgment of the world. They might have drawn back, many would have. The safer course, the wiser course by every worldly measure, was to let the dangerous thing die unspoken, to keep to their places, to choose duty and reputation over the perilous truth of what they felt. They did not draw back. They chose each other, knowing the cost, and held to that choice through everything that followed, and the whole of the rest of the story, the children, and the scandal, and the long endurance, and the triumph at the last, flowed from that first brave and dangerous choice, made somewhere in the quiet of a ducal household, to love where love was forbidden, and to hold to it whatever the world should say. The Duke, meanwhile, had married again, but not for love. With his lovely Blanche dead, he had made the kind of marriage that foremost princes make, a marriage for ambition and for a crown, taking as his second wife a Spanish princess named Constance, the daughter of the deposed King of Castile, and through her laying claim to a kingdom across the sea. It was a grand match and a cold one, a marriage of state that made the Duke a king in his own claim, the King of Castile, by right of his wife, and he would spend years and fortunes chasing that distant Spanish crown. The man at the centre of Catherine's life deserves to be understood, for he was one of the most formidable and most divisive figures of his age. He was a younger son of a great king, which is a hard thing to be, for he had royal blood and royal pride and immense ability, but stood always a little to the side of the throne, never to be King of England himself, forever the great prince behind the crown, rather than the crown itself. He was magnificent, proud, capable, a soldier and a statesman who carried much of the burden of governing the realm through the long decline of his father and the troubled youth of his nephew, and he was, for much of his life, the most powerful and the most hated man in England, blamed by the people for every failure of the government, suspected of reaching for the throne, the target of the Commons' fury in the sweeping rising. He chased a crown of his own across the sea in Spain, pouring years and treasure into the claim he held through his second wife, and never quite grasped it. He was, in short, a man of vast ambitions, never fully satisfied, a king's son who was never king, carrying through his life a weight of power and unpopularity and thwarted desire. And in the midst of all that, the one constant, the one place of warmth and ease was Catherine, the woman who asked nothing of his power and offered only herself. And it is no wonder that a man so burdened and so embattled should have loved so deeply and so long the one person in his life who wanted him and not his greatness. 3 women shaped the Duke's long life, and it is worth setting them side by side, for between them they tell the story of how love and marriage worked in his world and how Catherine stood apart from it. There was Blanche, the lovely heiress of his youth, whom he married for her vast inheritance, but came truly to love, the radiant first Duchess the poets mourned, the wife of his young manhood, who gave him his heir and died too soon. There was Constance, the Spanish princess of his middle years, whom he married for a crown and never loved, the proud, devout stranger who held the title of his wife, while her heart and his were elsewhere, the marriage of pure ambition. And there was Catherine, the love of his long life, who held no title and brought no land and no crown, who was his by no arrangement of families or kingdoms, but only by the free choice of 2 hearts. The one of his 3 women he loved, not for what she brought him, but simply for herself. Blanche he married for her lands and loved. Constance he married for her crown and did not love. Catherine he loved first and married last, for nothing but love itself. The 3 of them map the whole range of marriage in that age. The match for land, the match for a crown, and the rarest thing of all, the match for love. And it was Catherine, the lowest born of the 3, who alone held the Duke's heart through all of his life and was chosen by him, at the last, for no reason in all the world but that he loved her. There is the measure of what she was to him, set against the others, the one he would have chosen freely from the start, had his world allowed it, and the one he chose freely at the end, when at last it did. To understand their love is to understand that she was his refuge from a life of strife, and he, to her, was not the hated Duke of the Chronicles, but the man she knew in private, lonely and human beneath all his magnificence. And we may guess at what she gave him too, across those long years, for it was no small thing. To a man hated by his people, suspected by his king, embattled on every side, forever carrying the weight of power and the burden of an unpopularity he could never quite escape, Catherine offered the one thing his whole world of flatterers and rivals and dependents could not, a love that wanted nothing from him, that asked for no grant and no favour and no advancement, that valued the man and not the prince. In her company, we may imagine, he could set down for a while the heavy armour of his greatness and simply be himself, loved for himself, at ease, as he could be nowhere else in his guarded and embattled life. That is a gift beyond price to a great and a lonely man, and it is surely part of why he held to her so faithfully across the decades, through every reason of policy that urged him to let her go. For she was his refuge, the one warm and uncomplicated place in a life of strife, and a man does not lightly give up his only refuge. They gave each other, in the end, the same thing, a true companionship in a world that offered each of them little of it. She, the great prince's refuge, and he, the scorned woman's vindication. 2 people who found in each other what the rest of their hard world withheld, and held to it against everything to the end. But Constance was a stranger to him, proud and devout and foreign, and there was no warmth in the match. Only policy we should spare a thought, in fairness, for Constance herself, for she too was a figure caught in the hard machinery of her age, and her story has its own sadness. She was the daughter of a king of Castile who had been overthrown and killed an exile and an heiress to a lost throne, and the Duke had married her to gain through her the claim to that Spanish crown, a marriage of pure ambition on his side. She came to England a proud and devout Spanish princess, a stranger in a cold northern land, married to a man whose heart, she must soon have learned, was given elsewhere, to the Englishwoman who raised his daughters. It cannot have been a happy life to be the wife of state, while another was the wife of the heart, to hold the title and the rank, while Catherine held the love. And Constance seems to have withdrawn into her devotions and her Spanish household, and her dreams of the lost Castilian throne, living a separate and a lonely life beside a husband who chased her crown but did not love her. There is no villain in this, only the ordinary tragedy of the age's way of marriage, in which great matches were made for land and crowns and not for love, and hearts went where they would regardless. Constance had her dignity and her claim and her devout faith. Catherine had the Duke's love, and the Duke had his Spanish ambitions and his English mistress, both in the tangled way of a proud man's life. When Constance died after her long cold marriage, it freed the Duke to follow his heart at last. But we should not forget that her death, which was Catherine's opening, was also the quiet end of another woman's hard and loveless life. A princess who had given her whole self to a crown that was never won, and a husband who was never hers. And it was in these very years, married to his Spanish princess and dreaming of his Spanish crown, that the Duke turned, quietly and against every rule of his world, to the gentle Englishwoman who was raising his daughters, the widow Katherine Swynford. What began between them we cannot exactly trace, for it began in secret, but begin it did, and it was no passing fancy, but a deep and lasting love. The love of two people who had each lost the partners of their youth, and found in each other something that neither marriage nor policy had given them. The Duke loved Catherine, truly and for the rest of his life, and she loved him, and they became, in the years of his marriage to Constance, lovers, the prince and the governess, in a bond that the world would condemn, and that would outlast every condemnation. What drew these two so powerfully together, across the great gulf of rank that separated a king's son from a knight's widow, we can only guess at. But the shape of it is clear enough. Here was a man who had married first for love, and lost that love to death, and then married for a crown, and found in that match only coldness and policy, a proud and lonely prince, surrounded by flatterers and enemies, carrying the weight of half the kingdom's government on his shoulders, distrusted by the people, burdened and embattled. And here, in his own household, raising his motherless daughters, was a woman of grace and warmth and intelligence, educated, capable, gentle, who had known him for years, who asked nothing of him but offered simply by being near. The ease and the understanding and the affection that all his power could not buy. It is not hard to see how a tired and lonely man might come to love such a woman, nor how she, a young widow whose own husband had given her little, might come to love the magnificent and unhappy prince whose children she cherished. Theirs was not the sudden passion of a tale, but the slow, deep growth of love between two people thrown together in daily intimacy, who came, over time, to find in each other the thing each most needed. And it had the durability of such loves, the quality of having grown from real knowledge and real companionship rather than from mere desire. That is why it lasted, where a lesser thing would have burned out, why it survived separation and scandal and the passing of the years, and why it ended at the last, not in the boredom or the bitterness that ends most such affairs, but in marriage, in the open and honoured union of two people who had simply never stopped loving each other. It was, by the hard judgment of their age, a sin and a scandal, for the Duke was a married man, and Catherine was his mistress, the woman he loved and kept outside his marriage, and there is no softening of what it was in the eyes of their world. The world Catherine lived in had a hard and a settled view of such things, and it bore down far more heavily on the woman than on the man. It was an age that took the law of the Church with deadly seriousness, that held marriage sacred and adultery a grave sin, and that judged a woman, above all, by her chastity and her honour, so that for a woman to be a leading man's mistress was to forfeit her good name entirely, to be marked for life as fallen and shameful, whatever the circumstances. A powerful man might keep a mistress and lose little by it, for the world half expected it of him, and his sins were soon forgiven or forgotten. But the woman bore the whole weight of the disgrace, named a harlot, blamed for tempting him, held up as a warning to others, her shame following her wherever she went. And the children of such a union carried the stain too, marked as illegitimate, base-born, barred by the law from inheritance and honour, their birth a lifelong reproach. Catherine knew all of this surely when she gave herself to the Duke. She was no innocent girl, but a grown woman of the court, who understood exactly the price a woman paid for such a love. The good name lost, the children shadowed, the scorn of the righteous. That she chose it anyway, and held to it, and bore the long disgrace with dignity, rather than hiding or recanting, tells us something about the depth of what she felt and the strength of what she was. For she did not stumble into ruin, but walked into it, open-eyed, for love, and carried its cost for a quarter of a century before the world, at the very last, was forced to take it all back. And yet it was also, plainly, a true and a faithful love, not the careless lust of a noble man for a serving woman, but a settled and enduring devotion that lasted across decades and survived every storm, and that would end, against all expectation, in marriage. When we speak of the length of their love, we should let the sheer span of the years sink in, for it is the thing that lifts their story above the common run of great men's affairs. This was no matter of a season or a few years, the usual life of such attachments, but a love that ran across the better part of both their adult lives, beginning when they were both still young, in the first widowhoods of their middle years, and ending only with the Duke's death in old age, a span of some 25 years and more, from its quiet beginning to the marriage that crowned it, and longer still, to his death. Across all that vast length of time, through every change of fortune, the love held. For year after year, Catherine held the Duke's heart, through his Spanish marriage, through his political triumphs and disasters, through the open disapproval of the whole kingdom, and he held hers, and they had children together. And he provided for her and for them, with an open and unembarrassed generosity that scandalized the chroniclers, but spoke, in its way, of how deeply he was bound to her. The provision he made for her was real and substantial, the solid underpinning of her strange position, for the Duke gave her lands and houses and money, granted her wardships and rights, saw that she and her children were maintained in comfort, and even in some style, all of it set down in the careful records of his vast estate. To be the mistress of such a prince, scandalous as it was also to be a woman of means, lodged well, attended, provided for, lifted by his generosity far above the modest estate of her Swynford widowhood. And this material reality was part of the strangeness of her place, that she was at once disgraced in her honour and elevated in her circumstances. A fallen woman living in comfort and consequence. It scandalised the moralists, of course, that the Duke should so openly maintain his mistress and her children, making no secret of his care for them, for a more cautious or a more ashamed man would have hidden such provision away. And the openness of it was a kind of declaration, a refusal to treat Catherine as a thing to be concealed. He provided for her not as a man pays off a guilty secret, but as a man cares for his own, openly and generously. And that openness, scandalous as the world found it, was itself a sign of how he regarded her. Not as a passing indulgence, but as a person who belonged to him and for whom he was responsible. The comfort of her years then, even the years of scandal and the years of supposed separation, was the gift of his steady care. The material shape of a love that expressed itself, where it could not yet speak openly, in the solid language of lands and houses and provision. Her position was a strange and a dangerous one, the most privileged and the most exposed in the land, for she was the beloved of the greatest prince in England. Lodged in comfort, her children cared for, her every need met. And at the same time, she was a kept woman, a mistress, with no security but the Duke's love, no defence against the world's contempt, no place in the order of things that her age would honour. She walked, for years, that narrow and perilous line, neither wife nor servant, the Duke's secret that was no secret at all, and she walked it with a dignity that even her enemies could not quite take from her. Her position, strange as it was, carried its own kind of quiet power, for the beloved of a great prince was a person of consequence, whether the world approved of her or not. Those who sought the Duke's favour knew that a word from Catherine might help their cause, and so she would have had her petitioners, her suitors for influence, people who courted the mistress in hope of reaching the prince, and this soft and unofficial power, the power of the one who has the ear and the heart of the mighty, was real, however unacknowledged. At the same time, her life was a watched one, lived always under observing eyes, for a figure so close to so great and so controversial a man was of intense interest to everyone around him. Her movements noted, her influence measured, her every appearance the subject of comment and calculation. To live so, watched and courted and condemned all at once, the object of the world's curiosity and the world's disapproval together, required a particular strength, the ability to carry oneself with composure under constant scrutiny, to give nothing away, to be at ease in an impossible position. And Catherine, by every sign, had exactly that strength, moving through her watched and perilous life with a dignity and a discretion that her enemies could mock but could not break, neither flaunting her position nor cringing under the scorn, but simply holding her course with a steady composure that was, in its quiet way, a kind of mastery. It is no small thing to live for years in so exposed and so impossible a place, and to keep one's dignity through all of it, and that she did so is one more measure of the woman. Motherhood was a large part of who Catherine was, across the whole of her life, for she was a mother many times over, and to more than one family, and the care of children ran like a thread through all her years, her own and others alike. She had borne her Swynford children to her first husband, and raised the Duke's daughters as their governess, and now, out of her long love for the Duke, she became a mother again. Out of that long love came children, 4 of them, born to Catherine and the Duke across the years of their bond, and they were given, since they could not bear the Duke's own royal style, a name of their own, Beaufort. Taken from one of the Duke's lordships across the sea, a name that would in time become one of the most fateful in all English history. There were 3 sons and a daughter, John and Henry and Thomas Beaufort, and a girl named Joan, and they were born outside marriage, illegitimate by the law of the Church, the children of the Duke's sin. And yet they were not hidden away in shame, but raised openly, cared for, loved, and provided for by their father, with the same open generosity he showed their mother. it is worth pausing to follow, even a little, the astonishing futures of these 4 children, for it is in them that the deepest meaning of Catherine's life is written. The eldest son, John Beaufort, would be made an earl, a soldier, and a man of standing, and from him would descend, in 2 generations, the mother of the first Tudor king. The second son, Henry Beaufort, would rise in the church to become a bishop and then a cardinal, one of the richest and most powerful men in all of England, a lender of fortunes to kings, and a force in the government of the realm for half a century, the grandest churchman the kingdom produced in his age. The third son, Thomas Beaufort, would become an admiral and a duke, a commander in the wars in France. And the daughter, Joan Beaufort, would marry into the mighty house of Neville and become the matriarch of a vast brood of children who would marry into nearly every great family in the land, scattering Catherine's blood through the whole high nobility of England. From 4 children born in scandal, then came an earl, a cardinal, a duke, and the grandmother of half the aristocracy, and beyond them, in the generations to follow, the kings themselves. The very name they bore, Beaufort, carried its own quiet story, for it was taken from a lordship the Duke had held across the sea, a castle and its lands in the country of Champagne, in France. One of the many honours that had come to him in the tangled inheritances of his remarkable career. It was a name with no claim to royalty in it, deliberately so, a name of their own that set the children apart from the royal style they could not bear. And yet it would become, through their rise, one of the most charged names in English history, a name that would echo through the wars and the crowns of the century to come. Nor were the Beauforts Catherine's only children, for she had her Swynford children too, by her first husband, and they were not forgotten in the rise of their half-brothers and half-sister. Her Swynford son, Thomas, grew up to serve the House of Lancaster faithfully, a loyal man of the family his mother had joined, bound to the fortunes of the dynasty through all the turns of the age. So Catherine was the mother of 2 families, the Swynfords of her marriage and the Beauforts of her love, and both were woven into the House of Lancaster, the one by service and the other by blood, and through them both her line ran on into the England that was coming. But it was the Beauforts, the children of the love the world had condemned, who would climb the highest and reach the farthest, the name taken from a French castle becoming, in the end, a name spoken in the same breath as the crown of England itself. The Duke understood, perhaps, the quality of the children he had fathered, for he advanced them with care and devotion all his life, and the law would in time be bent to make them lawful. But none of that was certain when they were small. Then they were only the love children of a scandalous union, dear to their parents, shadowed by their birth, their glittering futures hidden, like everything else in Catherine's life, behind the long patience of the years. The Duke never disowned them, never treated them as anything but his own beloved children, and he set himself, as they grew, to advance them, to find them places and marriages and futures worthy of his blood, for whatever the law said, they were his, and he loved them. And these 4 children, born of a scandalous love and named for a foreign lordship, would rise beyond anything their birth could have promised. One to be a mighty soldier and the grandfather of a king. One to be a cardinal of the church and the richest man in England. One to be an admiral and a duke, and the daughter to be the grandmother of 2 kings, the ancestress, through her many children, of the whole later royalty of England. From Catherine's womb, from the body of the woman the chroniclers called a harlot, came the blood that would sit on the throne of England for centuries. But all of that lay far in the future. For now, they were only the Duke's love children, dear to their parents and a scandal to the world. And the world did not forgive her. The chroniclers of the age, monks and clerks who set down the doings of the great, turned upon Catherine with a venom they reserved for few. For to them she was the temptress who had ensnared a prince, the seductress who had led the great duke into sin, and they called her foul names, a witch, a she-devil, a whore, blaming her, as such men always blamed the woman, for a love that two people had made together. We do not even know, for all the ink the chroniclers spilled on her, what she looked like, for no certain likeness of Catherine survives, no portrait painted from life, no description we can wholly trust. We are told she was beautiful, for the Duke loved her, and the moralists feared her power over him. And a woman blamed as a temptress is always, in the telling, made lovely. But whether she was truly a great beauty, or simply a woman of grace and presence and warmth, we cannot say. We do not know the colour of her hair or her eyes, the sound of her voice, the look of her face, any of the small particulars by which we know a living person. All of that is lost, dissolved into the silence of 600 years. She comes to us faceless, in a sense, a woman of immense consequence whose very appearance is a blank, and we are left to imagine her as we will, the gentle governess, the beloved mistress, the dignified duchess, putting our own face to the woman behind the deeds. There is something fitting perhaps in that facelessness, for it is the common fate of women in that age, even the greatest of them, to be remembered for what they were to men, the wife, the mistress, the mother, rather than for themselves, their own faces and voices lost, while the deeds of the men around them are recorded in detail. Catherine endures, vivid in her story and blank in her person. A life of the sharpest consequence, lived by a woman we would not recognize if she passed us in the street. And that, too, is part of the truth of her, and of all the unremembered women of her time. It was deeply unjust, for the Duke was a grown man and a willing one, and the choice was as much his as hers, and more, for he held all the power in the matter. But it is the woman who is blamed in such tales, and it was Catherine who bore the weight of the scandal. Her name dragged through the chronicles, her character blackened, held up as a warning and a disgrace. She was blamed, too, for the failures and the unpopularity of the Duke himself, as though his sins in government were the fault of the woman he loved. And when the kingdom turned against the proud Duke, as it did more than once, the hatred splashed onto her, the foreign-born mistress, the low woman who had risen above her station. She bore it, by all the signs, with a quiet endurance, neither fighting the slander nor being broken by it, living her life and raising her children through years of public contempt, and the dignity with which she carried that long shame is, in its way, as remarkable as anything in her story. For the chroniclers threw all the mud they had, and somehow, across the centuries, it is not their venom we remember but her, and the love that outlasted it. It is worth reflecting on how her story has come down to us, for it is a lesson in how the judgments of an age can be overturned by time. In her own day, and for long after, Catherine was remembered, when she was remembered at all, largely through the venom of the chroniclers who had condemned her, the monks and clerks who set down their disapproval of the scandalous mistress, the temptress who had ensnared a prince. Theirs was the official verdict, the moral judgment of the church and the establishment, and it might have been expected to fix her memory forever as a cautionary tale of female sin. But time has a way of seeing differently than the men who write the first drafts of history, and as the centuries passed and the moral certainties of her age softened, later ages came to look at Catherine and to see not a temptress, but a woman of remarkable dignity and constancy, the heroine of a deep love story, wronged by the harsh judgments of her time and vindicated by the depth and the endurance of her devotion. The very things the chroniclers had condemned, her long love outside marriage, her refusal to be shamed into renouncing it in her heart, came to look, to later eyes, like courage and faithfulness rather than sin. And so her reputation has been remade across the centuries. the harlot of the chronicles, becoming the beloved of the histories and the tales. The woman the monks blackened, becoming one of the most sympathetic figures of her whole age. It is a reminder that the harsh verdicts of any moment are not the final word. That time and changing eyes can lift a wronged name out of the mud, and that the truth of a life is often kinder, in the long run, than the judgment of those who first set it down. So it is that Katherine Swynford, dismissed in her own day as a low-born temptress, has become across the centuries one of the best-loved figures of the whole English medieval age. Her story told and retold. Her name known where the names of greater and prouder women of her time have faded. There is a reason her tale, of all the tales of that distant century, has kept its hold on the imagination. And it is that it answers something deep in us, the longing to see love rewarded and patience vindicated, the wish that the scorned and the faithful might be lifted at the last above those who scorned them. Hers is a story with the shape of the oldest and the dearest of tales, the poor girl who wins the prince, the despised one raised to glory, the faithful heart rewarded after long trial, and yet it is no invention, no comforting fable, but a thing that truly happened to a real woman in a real and a hard world, which is why it moves us as no mere story could. The proud chroniclers who blackened her would never have believed that it was their venom that would be forgotten and her constancy that would be remembered, that the centuries would take the side of the woman they condemned against the righteous men who condemned her. But so it has fallen out, and there is a justice in it deeper than any the chroniclers knew, that the woman who held to love through a lifetime of scorn should be loved, in the end, by all the ages that came after, while her detractors are remembered, if at all, only as the foil to her quiet triumph. Then came the year of the Great Rising, when the common people of England, ground down by taxes and injustice, rose in their thousands and marched on London in a fury that shook the kingdom to its roots. It is worth remembering how dangerous those years were for Catherine herself, and not only for the Duke, for to be the known mistress of the most hated man in England was to stand very near the centre of the storm. The rebels who burned the Savoy and cried that they would have no king named John would have shown little mercy to the woman they regarded as the Duke's harlot. Had she fallen into their hands, and there were others too in the political quarrels of those years, who would gladly have used Catherine as a weapon against the Duke, a scandal to be paraded, a weakness to be exploited. She lived, through the years of the affair, not only with the moral contempt of the chroniclers, but with real danger, the danger of being caught up in the hatred and the violence that swirled around the man she loved. And it took courage as well as constancy to hold her place at his side through such times. And of all the powerful lords of the realm, none was more hated by the rebels than the proud Duke of Lancaster, whom they blamed above all others for the misgovernment of the realm. So that when the mob broke into the city, they made straight for his magnificent riverside palace, the Savoy, the most splendid private house in England, and burned it to the ground, destroying its treasures in a frenzy of hatred, declaring they would have no king named John. The burning of the Savoy was one of the most dramatic moments of the whole rising, and it shows the depth of the hatred that had gathered against the house Catherine had bound her life to. The rebels, when they broke into the palace, did a strange and a telling thing, for they did not loot it, did not carry off its riches as common robbers would, but deliberately destroyed everything, smashing the gold and silver plate, hacking the precious hangings to pieces, throwing the Duke's treasures into the river, even, it was said, grinding his jewels to powder, declaring that they were not thieves but men of justice, come to punish a traitor, not to enrich themselves. They burned the most splendid private house in the kingdom to a shell, and with it a lifetime's gathering of treasures. The visible glory of the House of Lancaster, and the message of it was unmistakable. That the common people of England held the proud Duke responsible, above all other men, for everything that had gone wrong in the realm. It was a terrifying eruption of the anger of the powerless against the mightiest man in the land. And though the Duke himself was safe in the north, the destruction of his grand palace was a profound blow to his pride and his standing. A sign written in fire that he was the most hated man in England. And in the dangerous aftermath, with the kingdom still trembling and the Duke desperate to rebuild his shattered reputation, the pressure upon him to set right his life, to put away the scandal of his mistress and make his peace with God and the moralists, became more than he could resist. The Duke himself was far away in the north and escaped the fury, but the rising shook him profoundly, and in its aftermath, in a kingdom seething with hatred against him, and with the church and the moralists pressing him hard, the Duke did a thing that must have wounded Catherine to the heart. He publicly renounced her, in a formal and humiliating act of penance, seeking to mend his battered reputation and quiet the moral outrage against him. He put Catherine away, declared their relationship at an end, named it the sin it had been, and separated himself from her, sending her from his side. Whether he did it from genuine remorse, or from cold political need, or from some tangle of both, we cannot know, but he did it publicly, and Catherine was cast off, named a sinner before the whole kingdom, sent away from the man she had loved and served for years. We can only imagine what that public renunciation cost her, the humiliation of it, the pain. To have her love named a sin before the whole kingdom, to be formally and publicly put away by the man she had given her good name for, to be sent from his side and held up as the cause of his disgrace. All of it, in the full glare of a watching realm, was about as bitter a blow as her age could deal a woman. She had borne years of private scandal for love of him. Now she bore the public renunciation too. Cast off and shamed, and there would have been many, surely, who expected her to vanish then into ruin and obscurity, a discarded mistress with nothing left. And yet the remarkable thing, the proof that tells us how true the bond between them really was, is that the renunciation, for all its public completeness, did not end the love at all. The Duke put her away in the eyes of the world, but he never stopped caring for her or for their children. He kept her provided for, kept advancing the Beauforts, kept the connection alive beneath the surface, and there is every reason to think the two of them remained, through all the years of their supposed separation, bound to each other as deeply as ever. The renunciation was an act done for appearances, a public penance to quiet the moralists and mend a battered name, and the world took it for the ending of the affair. But it was not the ending. It was only a long interval, a withdrawal into shadow, and beneath the show of separation the real thing endured, waiting, as Catherine had learned to wait, for the day it could come back into the light. She withdrew then into a quieter life, retiring from the dangerous heights of the ducal court to live for the most part in the city of Lincoln, in the shadow of its soaring cathedral, in a house in the cathedral close, a respectable widow raising her children. Lincoln was a fine and an ancient city, one of the foremost cities of the kingdom, set on a steep hill above the flat fenland country, crowned by one of the most magnificent cathedrals in all of Christendom. A vast and soaring church of pale stone, whose towers could be seen for many miles across the level land. To live in the shadow of such a building was to live in the presence of the highest art and aspiration of the age. For the great cathedrals were the supreme achievement of medieval people, the works into which they poured their wealth and their genius and their faith down the generations it took to raise them. The cathedral at Lincoln was among the loveliest of them all, a forest of pale climbing stone, its high arches reaching toward heaven, its windows blazing with coloured glass that threw down pools of jewelled light, its long nave and choir filled with the sound of the daily round of prayer and chant that rose from it without ceasing, the work of the canons and clergy who served it. It dominated the city and the country for miles around, a mountain of carved stone on its hilltop, visible over the whole flat fenland, a constant presence in the life and the eye of everyone who lived near it. The very image of the eternal set against the brief lives of those who dwelt beneath it. For Catherine, in her years in the cathedral close, this vast church was the centre of her daily world, the place of her devotions, the pale stone backdrop to her quiet retirement, and it would be, in the end, both the scene of her greatest triumph and the keeper of her bones. There is a rightness in the deep bond between this woman and this building, for both, in their way, were testaments to endurance and aspiration. The cathedral raised stone by stone across the patient generations. Catherine raised to greatness through the patient years. And it is fitting beyond words that her long, strange journey should have ended beneath that soaring stone. The Duchess at rest in the loveliest church in the land. Around the cathedral lay the close, a precinct of fine houses where the clergy and the well-to-do connected with the grand church lived. A quiet and a respectable and a comfortable world, and it was here, among the canons and the gentry of the cathedral city, that Catherine made her home in the years of her retirement. It suited her, this dignified and settled life, after the dangerous brilliance of the ducal court, and she lived it as a woman of substance and standing, holding her lands, ordering her household, raising her children, a respected figure in the life of the city. Religion ran through every hour of a life like hers, far more deeply than we can easily imagine, for the people of that age lived within their faith as within the very air they breathed. The day was marked out by the hours of prayer, the year by the great cycle of the church's feasts and fasts, and a woman of Catherine's rank would have ordered her devotions carefully, hearing Mass daily, keeping the holy days, following the offices of the church from her own precious book of hours, giving alms to the poor, founding or supporting chantries where priests would pray for the souls of her family. To live in a cathedral close as she did was to live at the very heart of the religious life of the city, surrounded by the clergy, woven into the daily round of worship that rose without ceasing from the vast church. And there was, for a woman who had lived through the long scandal of an unlawful love, a particular weight to the consolations and the demands of faith. For the church that condemned her sin also offered her its mercy, the hope of forgiveness, the assurance that a contrite heart might yet be reconciled to God. We cannot read Catherine's soul, but we may guess that her faith was a real and a sustaining thing across the hard years, the framework within which she understood her own strange life, its falls and its risings, its sins and its endurances, and that the soaring church beneath whose shadow she lived and married and was buried was, for her, not merely a backdrop, but the deep abiding centre of a life lived, as all lives then were lived, beneath the eye of heaven. She had means, for the Duke saw to it that she never wanted, and she had position, for whatever the scandal of her past, she was a gentlewoman of education and grace connected to the greatest house in the land. And she seems to have been genuinely esteemed in Lincoln, woven into the religious and social life of the cathedral close. It was a good life, in its way, a calm harbour after storms, and it might have been the whole of her later years, the dignified retirement of a knight's widow with a colourful past, the scandal slowly fading, the children growing, the days passing in the quiet shadow of the great church. And it is a fitting thing that the city which sheltered her in her years of withdrawal would be the city of her greatest triumph too, for it was in that same magnificent cathedral, in the end, that the cast-off mistress would be married to her prince and made a duchess, and beneath its pale stone, at the last, that she would be laid to rest. It might have been the end of her story, the cast-off mistress fading into obscurity and disgrace, but it was not, and the years of her retirement, far from being years of ruin, show how deep and how durable the bond between her and the Duke truly was. For even after the public renunciation, the Duke did not abandon her. He continued, quietly, to provide for her and for their children, to advance the young Beauforts, to keep Catherine in comfort and honour, and there is every sign that the love between them never truly ended, but only went underground, hidden from the world's eyes that had judged it so harshly. The years between the renunciation and the marriage were long, the better part of a decade and more, and they are in some ways the most telling years of the whole story. For they show what the love between Catherine and the Duke was truly made of. A passing infatuation does not survive a public renunciation and a decade of separation. It dies, forgotten, and the man moves on. But this did not die. Through all those years, while the world believed the affair over and done, the Duke kept Catherine close in every way that mattered, saw to her comfort and her honour, advanced their children, maintained the threads of connection between them, so that when at last the obstacle of his Spanish marriage was removed by death, he turned to her at once, as naturally as a river returns to its course, and made her his wife. The separation, in other words, had changed nothing in the heart of the matter. It had only driven the love out of sight for a season, a concession to the world's judgment rather than a true ending. And that is the deepest proof of what they were to each other. That across all those years of public separation, with every reason of policy and prudence, urging the Duke to let the connection lapse, he did not let it lapse, but held to it in shadow until he could bring it back into the light. Few loves in any age are tested as theirs was, by scandal and renunciation and the long passage of the years, and fewer still survive the testing. Theirs did, and came through it whole, and that is why it ended, not in the forgetting that ends most such affairs, but in a wedding in a cathedral, the rarest of endings. The love that would not die, brought home at last. To grasp how rare a thing it was, you must remember that marriage for love was almost unheard of among the great in that age, a luxury that the high-born could not afford. Among the nobility, marriages were arranged, often in childhood, as alliances between families, transfers of land and blood and power, in which the wishes of the two people joined counted for very little, and love, if it came at all, was expected to come after the wedding, not before it, and was in no way the reason for it. The age did have its own elaborate idea of love, the famous notion of courtly love that the poets sang, but it was a strange and an artificial thing, a game of the imagination rather than a guide to life. In the songs and the romances, the knight adored his lady from afar, suffered for her, served her, worshipped her as something almost divine, and this exalted love was understood to exist outside marriage and to have little to do with it. A refinement of feeling, a courtly pastime, often directed at a woman one could never marry, and frequently another man's wife. It was love as performance and as poetry, beautiful and unreal. And it sat oddly beside the hard, practical business of actual marriage, which was about land and blood and alliance, and had no room for such exalted feeling. What is striking about Catherine and her Duke is that their love was neither of these things, neither the cold arrangement of a real marriage, nor the artificial worship of the courtly game, but something rarer and truer than either, a real and a lasting love between two actual people that endured for a lifetime and ended, against all the rules, in a real marriage. They did not play at love in the courtly fashion, nor marry without it in the practical fashion. They simply loved truly and durably, and then, at the last, married for that love. Cutting through both the artificial romance of the poets and the loveless practicality of the matchmakers to something more solid and more human than either. It is perhaps why their story has outlived all the courtly romances of their age, because it was not a romance at all, but a true thing. And that truth, in the end, moves us more than any song. A high prince especially married for the highest reasons of state, for kingdoms and treasures and alliances, and the idea that he might choose his wife simply because he loved her, and choose a woman of no rank or fortune at all, was so far against the grain of his world as to be a scandal in itself. That is what makes the marriage of Catherine and the Duke so remarkable, and why it astonished all of Christendom, for it was that rarest of things, a great match made for no reason but love. A prince of the blood, marrying where his heart led against every consideration of policy and rank. It was, in its way, a quiet revolution, a defiance of the whole cold machinery of noble marriage, the assertion that love might matter more than land or blood or the judgment of society, and it succeeded and stood, lawful and honoured. A duchess made of a knight's widow for love alone. In an age that married for everything but love, Catherine and her duke married for love and nothing else, and that is a part of why their story has outlasted 6 centuries. For it is the eternal story, the one the human heart never tires of love that holds to its own truth against all the cold wisdom of the world, and wins. Catherine lived in Lincoln as a woman of substance and respectability, holding her lands, raising her children, a figure of dignity in the cathedral city, her scandalous past set aside, her quiet present secure. The Beaufort children grew up in these years, finding their places in life, the sons in the church and at arms, the daughter married well, all of them cared for by the father who had publicly disowned their mother, but never, in truth, let go of any of them. The Beauforts grew up bound by the closest ties of blood and loyalty to the House of Lancaster, and they would prove, in the generations to come, among its most faithful and most formidable supporters. A clan whose fortunes were knit to the dynasty their half-brother founded. They were, after all, the half-blood kin of the kings of Lancaster, the brothers and the sister of the king who seized the throne, and they threw their whole weight and their considerable talents into the service of that royal house. The soldier and the admiral fighting its wars, the cardinal governing its realm and lending it fortunes, the daughter binding it by marriage to the mighty Nevilles. There was a strength in them, a capability and an ambition that came perhaps from their strange beginnings, the need of children born under a shadow to prove themselves, to climb beyond the stain of their birth, and climb they did, becoming pillars of the kingdom. And through all their rise they remained, by every sign, a close and a loyal family, bound to one another and to the mother who had borne them, and the half-siblings who had been raised beside them. A clan that held together and advanced together, founded by a scandalous love and forged into one of the great connections of the age. Catherine had given them life under the hardest of circumstances, the children of a sin shadowed by their birth. But she had given them too, whatever it was that made them strong, and she lived to see them rise from that shadow into the light. The faithful and formidable Beauforts, the most consequential children any English mistress ever bore. It was a long, calm interval, the storm of scandal behind her, the complete vindication still to come. And through it, Catherine waited, whether she knew she was waiting or not, for the world to turn once more. If there is a single virtue that defines Catherine's whole life, it is patience, the quiet, unglamorous strength of those who endure and wait, and it is worth honouring. For it is a quieter thing than the dramatic virtues, but in the end, a more powerful one. She did not seize her fortune by boldness or scheming. She did not force the world to give her what she wanted. She simply held to what mattered to her, the love at the centre of her life and the children it had given her, and endured everything the world threw at her, the scandal and the slander and the public renunciation, without breaking and without surrendering, and waited. Her whole life was a long game, played with patience, the slow holding fast through obscurity and disgrace, until, at the very end, the patience was rewarded beyond anything she could have demanded. It is not the way of the heroes of most tales, who win their fortunes by daring and action, but it is, perhaps, a truer and a harder kind of strength. The strength to endure what cannot be changed and to hold one's course through the darkness in the faith, or even without the faith, that the wheel may yet turn. Katherine had that strength in abundance, and it was the making of her. For the bold and the scheming often overreach and fall, while the patient endure, and now and then, as in her case, the patient are lifted at the last to a height the bold never reach. Hers is a victory of endurance over circumstance, of constancy over scorn, of patience over the cruelty of the world, and there is a deep and a quiet inspiration in it. The triumph, not of the strong arm, but of the steadfast heart. The turning came with a death. The Duke's Spanish wife, Constance, the proud Castilian princess he had married for a crown and never loved, died after years of a cold and distant marriage, and her death, which meant little to the Duke's heart, changed everything for Katherine, for it left the greatest prince in England a widower once more, and free, after all the years, to marry where he chose. He was an old man now, by the measure of his age, his Spanish dreams long abandoned, his great career drawing toward its close, and his thoughts turned, as an aging man's will, not to ambition or policy, but to the one constant love of his long life. And he made a decision that astonished the whole of Christendom. He decided to marry Katherine, not to take her quietly back as his mistress, not to provide for her in some discreet corner of his life, but to marry her openly before the whole world, to make the woman the chroniclers had called a harlot, his wife and his duchess, the second lady in all of England. It was a thing almost without precedent, a prince of the blood royal, a king's son, marrying his low-born former mistress, the mother of his bastard children, and raising her to the very heights of the nobility. The world could scarcely believe it. They were married in the grand cathedral at Lincoln, in the city where Katherine had lived out her quiet years, and that ein had a stroke, the cast-off mistress became the Duchess of Lancaster, the wife of the king's own uncle, the first lady in the kingdom after the Queen herself. The marriage sent a wave of astonishment through the whole of England and beyond, for nothing quite like it had been seen before. Foremost princes did not marry their mistresses. They married for land and alliance and royal blood. And a king's son, who had the pick of the princesses of Europe, was expected to make a match that brought a kingdom or a treasure or a powerful friendship, not to wed a knight's widow of no fortune and a scandalous name. That the Duke, in the evening of his life, chose instead to marry for love, to raise the woman the world had condemned to the highest rank a woman could hold below the Queen, was a thing that defied every expectation of the age, and it was talked of in every court in Christendom. To some, it was a folly, an old man's weakness, the triumph of a scheming woman over a doting prince. To others, perhaps, it was something finer, the faithfulness of a great love rewarded at the last. But however it was judged, it was real, and it was lawful, and it could not be undone. The Duke had married his Katherine openly, in the sight of God and the realm, in the vast cathedral of the city, where she had waited out her years of shadow. And the woman who had entered the house of Lancaster as a servant in a duchess's train now stood within it as the duchess herself, its mistress, its first lady, lifted in a single ceremony from the deepest disgrace her world could inflict to the highest honour it could bestow. The marriage was not a simple thing to bring about, even once Constance was dead and the Duke free, for the long affair itself had raised an obstacle in the eyes of the Church. By the careful law of the Church, the very fact that the two had been lovers, and that there were children between them, created a kind of spiritual barrier to their marrying, a bar that had to be lifted by the highest authority before the union could be lawful and blessed. and so a dispensation was sought and granted from the Pope himself, a formal setting aside of the impediment, a declaration that the two might lawfully wed despite all that had passed between them, and only with that solemn blessing in hand could the marriage go forward as a true and sacramental union. There is something striking in that the same church which had condemned their love as a sin now, through its highest office, cleared the way for them to marry and blessed the joining of the two sinners into lawful husband and wife. The very obstacles the law raised were the measure of how far they had come, for they had to undo, with the Pope's own authority, the spiritual consequences of the long love before they could stand at the altar, and they did undo them, sparing no effort and no expense to make the marriage not merely a worldly fact, but a thing fully right in the eyes of God and the Church. So Catherine came to the altar, not as a kept woman grudgingly raised, but as a lawful bride. Her union blessed at the highest level of Christendom, every barrier formally lifted. The whole weight of the Church's authority turned at last from condemning her love to sanctifying it. It is one of the most extraordinary reversals in the whole history of the English nobility, and it happened to a poor knight's daughter from a fenland manor, for no better reason in all the world than that a prince had never stopped loving her. Imagine, if you can, what that day meant to her, the poor knight's daughter raised on a queen's charity, the fenland widow, the scorned mistress of all those years of scandal, now standing as a duchess in the heart of the cathedral, married at last to the man she had loved in secret and in shame for a quarter of a century, lifted in a single day from disgrace to the summit of the land. Let your mind rest for a moment on that day in the cathedral, for it is the still bright heart of her whole long story. Picture the vast church filled with light, the pale stones soaring overhead, the coloured windows throwing down their pools of jewelled colour, the proud company gathered, and at the heart of it, the ageing Duke and the woman he had loved through a lifetime, standing together at last before the altar to be wed. Think of all that lay behind that day for her: the foreign girl in the Queen's nursery, the bride at the muddy fenland manor, the gentlewoman in the Duchess's train, the governess of the motherless children, the beloved mistress of all the secret years, the mother of the shadowed children, the cast-off sinner of the public renunciation, the quiet widow in the cathedral close. All those Catherines, all those years of obscurity and scandal and patient endurance, gathered now into this single moment as she became, before God and the realm, the Duchess of Lancaster. There can have been few hours in any life so charged with the weight of a whole history, so complete a turning of fortune's wheel, the lowest brought to the highest, the shamed made honoured, the secret love made lawful before all. Whatever the proud ladies muttered, whatever the chroniclers wrote, in that hour Catherine had won, simply and completely, the thing she had wanted through the whole of her long life. And the great church that had sheltered her in her years of shadow now witnessed her triumph. The wedding of the Duchess, who had once been called a harlot, in a blaze of light beneath the soaring stone. It was a vindication so complete that it reads almost like a tale, the long-suffering love rewarded at the very end. The woman the world had condemned raised above all the proud ladies who had condemned her, and those proud ladies were appalled. The great duchesses and countesses of England, who now had to give precedence to this upstart, this former mistress raised over their heads, were said to be beside themselves with outrage, declaring they would not consent to be ranked below a woman of such low birth and such scandalous history. But their outrage changed nothing. Catherine was a duchess, lawfully married to the greatest prince in the land, and she took her place at the summit of the nobility. And the chroniclers who had called her a she-devil now had to call her Your Grace. The fury of the proud ladies tells us much about the world Catherine had broken into, for it was a world obsessed with rank and precedence, in which exactly who walked before whom, who sat above whom at the feast, who curtsied to whom, was a matter of the gravest importance, the visible map of the whole order of society. And now by her marriage, Catherine had vaulted to the very top of that order, a duchess of the blood royal by marriage, second only to the Queen, which meant that every other great lady in the land, the countesses and the duchesses, born to their rank and proud of their ancient blood, must now give way to her, walk behind her, yield her the precedence. This former mistress, this low-born woman with the scandalous past. To proud women who had been born to greatness, it was an intolerable affront that one such as Catherine should be set above them, and the chroniclers record their indignation, their refusal, their declarations that they would not demean themselves to keep company with such a creature. But for all their outrage, the order of precedence was the order of precedence, and Catherine was lawfully a duchess, and there was nothing the proud ladies could do but cede and submit. For the law and the rank were on her side. There is a quiet justice in it that is satisfying even across the centuries, that the woman who had endured so many years of their scorn now stood, lawfully and unanswerably, above them all, and that the same world which had named her a harlot was now obliged, by its own rigid rules, to bow to her and to call her Your Grace. She had not schemed her way there, whatever her enemies said. She had simply loved and endured and been loved in return, and the world's own laws had done the rest. With the marriage came the second rare gift, the making lawful of the children. For Catherine's 4 Beaufort children, born outside marriage, had been illegitimate all their lives, barred by the law of the Church from inheritance and from the honours that flowed from royal blood. And now their parents, lawfully wed at last, moved to wipe away the stain of their birth. The Duke obtained from the Pope a declaration legitimising the Beauforts, and then, more importantly still, from the King of England, his own nephew Richard, a solemn act, confirmed in Parliament, declaring the children of John and Catherine to be lawful and legitimate in the eyes of the law of the land, fully able to inherit and to rise as though they had been born in wedlock. It was an extraordinary act of love and of statecraft together, the Duke using all his vast influence to secure the futures of the children of his scandalous love. And it succeeded, and the Beauforts were made, at a stroke, a legitimate branch of the royal house, free to climb as high as their blood and their ability could carry them. The legitimising of children born outside marriage was no small or simple thing, for it cut against the whole weight of the law, both the law of the Church and the law of the land, which held the illegitimate firmly in their place, barred from inheritance, shut out from the honours of lawful blood. To undo that, to wipe away the stain of base birth, and make the Beauforts as though they had been born in wedlock, required the highest authorities in Christendom, and the Duke secured them all, the blessing of the Pope himself for the Church's part. And then the solemn act of the King of England, confirmed by the assembled Parliament of the realm for the law of the land. It was a measure of the Duke's vast power that he could obtain such a thing, bending the whole apparatus of church and state to legitimise the children of his love. And it was a measure of his devotion that he troubled to do it. There was, as it happened, a strange afterlife to this act. For years later, when the Duke's lawful son had seized the throne and become king, that son added to the grant of legitimacy a single clause of his own, declaring that the Beauforts, lawful in all other things, were barred from any claim to the crown of England itself, a fence raised around the throne to keep his half-blood kin from it. It was a clause that would be pored over and argued and quietly ignored in the generations to come, for in the end it was through this very Beaufort line, barred though it was, that the crown would descend. The fence proving no barrier at all when the time came. But in Catherine's day, the legitimacy was simply a triumph and a mercy. Her children made whole in the eyes of the law. The shadow lifted from their birth. Their futures opened wide. the last precious gift of the love that had so long been counted only as a sin. There would be added, in a later reign, by the Duke's own legitimate son, once he was king, a single fateful clause barring the Beauforts from any claim to the throne itself, a clause that would one day be argued over and quietly set aside. For it was through this very Beaufort line, legitimised by their parents' love, that the crown of England would in the end descend. But in Catherine's lifetime, the legitimisation was simply a triumph. Her children made lawful, her family secured, the scandal of their birth wiped clean by the marriage that crowned her life. So Catherine came, in the autumn of her life, into a few years of greatness, such as she could never have imagined as the foreign girl in the Queen's household or the widow at muddy Kettlethorpe. She stood now at the very summit of the nobility. A great princess of the house, she had once entered as a servant in a duchess's train, and she held that place with the same grace and dignity she had carried through all her years of obscurity and scandal. For she had been trained for greatness, after all, in the Queen's household long ago, and now at last she lived it. To her contemporaries, the wonder of it must have been almost past believing, for nothing in the ordinary run of their world had prepared them for such a thing. They had watched her for years as the Duke's mistress, the scandal of the court, the low-born woman living in sin with the great prince, an object of disapproval and of pity and of scorn. And now, in a single stroke, that same woman was raised above them all, made a duchess of the blood royal, set at the very summit of the realm. It overturned every expectation, defied every rule, and it must have seemed to many who witnessed it like the world stood briefly on its head. The despised one exalted, the sinner crowned, the order of things turned upside down. There were those, no doubt, who muttered that it could not last, that such an unnatural elevation must come to grief, that the wheel that had lifted her so high would surely cast her down again. But it did not. The marriage held, the honour held. The children were made lawful, and Catherine kept her place at the summit, to the end of her days, and passed it on to her descendants, who would climb higher still. What had seemed to her contemporaries an astonishing aberration, a scandal raised past all reason, turned out to be the foundation of a new and an enduring greatness, the root of kings. They could not see it then, those who watched and muttered. They saw only the impossible elevation of a fallen woman. But time would prove that the impossible thing was also the lasting one, and that the wonder they could scarcely believe was the beginning of one of the foremost bloodlines of their nation. She had her precedence, her honours, her household, her place at the great occasions of the realm, and she had, above all, what she had truly wanted through all the long years, the man she loved, openly and lawfully hers at last. No longer a secret or a sin, but a husband by her side in the eyes of God and the world. Picture her in those years, the Duchess of Lancaster at the height of her honour, and see how completely the wheel had turned for her. She who had been a poor knight's daughter, living on a queen's charity, now had a grand household of her own to command, servants and gentlewomen and officers, ordered around her person, the very kind of establishment she had once served in as a girl. She who had been named a harlot in the chronicles now took her place at the high tables of the realm, at the great feasts and the solemn ceremonies. Walking in her precedence before all the proud ladies of the land, she who had loved in secret and in shame now sat openly beside her husband, honoured as his wife, her children gathered around them lawful and rising, the whole scandal transmuted at last into respectability and triumph. And she carried it, by every sign, with the same grace she had shown in obscurity, neither vengeful toward those who had scorned her, nor puffed up by her sudden greatness, but dignified, gracious, at ease in her high place, as she had been trained to be long ago in the Queen's household. There is no record of her gloating, no sign of her using her new power to punish her old detractors. She simply took her rightful place and filled it well. The noble lady she had always, in her bearing and her spirit, been. It was a short season, this time of crowned and honoured love, but it was the fulfilment of everything, the long patience rewarded, the love made lawful, the woman the world had cast down lifted at last to the summit, and she had earned every day of it through a lifetime of quiet endurance. They were not many, these years of crowned love, for the Duke was old and his health was failing, and the time they had as husband and wife was short. But they were sweet, surely. After so long, the two of them together at the end, the scandal behind them, the children secured, the love that had endured a quarter of a century of shame and separation, now blessed and honoured and complete. The poor knight's daughter had become a duchess, and the secret love had become a marriage. And for a few short years, Catherine lived in the light she had earned through a lifetime in the shadows. Then the Duke died. The great prince, the king's son, the richest and mightiest nobleman in England, the man Catherine had loved for more than half her life, grew old and sick and died at last, full of years. And Catherine was a widow once more. The Dowager Duchess of Lancaster, alone again at the end, as she had been so often through her long life. His last years had been clouded ones, for all his magnificence, for he had seen his remarkable career wind down toward its close. His Spanish dreams abandoned, his health failing, the realm sliding toward the crisis that would break upon it after his death. The kingdom in those last years of the Duke's life was a tense and an unhappy place. For the young king, the Duke's nephew, had grown into a willful and a suspicious ruler at odds with much of his nobility, and the old certainties of the realm were fraying toward open conflict. The Duke, for all the hatred the people had borne him in his prime, had come in his later years to be a kind of steadying weight in the realm. The great elder statesman, whose vast power and royal blood held the balance and kept the peace, and there were those who feared, rightly, what would come when that weight was removed. For with the old Duke gone, there was nothing to restrain the quarrel between the young king and the Duke's own exiled son, and within a few short months of the Duke's death, the storm broke. The son returning from exile to seize first his inheritance, and then the crown itself, deposing the king and founding the new royal house of Lancaster upon the ruins of the old order. So the Duke died on the very eve of the great upheaval, the last of the old generation, and his death was in a sense the signal for the storm, the removal of the one man whose presence had held the gathering crisis in check. Catherine, widowed, stood at the threshold of this new and dangerous age, the age her stepson's seizure of the crown would open, and she would live just long enough to see her own family lifted to the summit of it. Her Beaufort children raised by their half-brother's crown into the heart of the new royal house, before her own life drew quietly to its close. He had quarrelled with the young king his nephew, seen his own son driven into exile, and gone to his grave, by some accounts a weary and a disappointed man, the giant of his age fading at the last. But he had, in those closing years, the one great consolation of his Catherine openly beside him, at last, his lawful wife, the love of his life acknowledged before the world, and whatever disappointments shadowed his end, he did not face it alone, but with the woman he had loved through everything at his side. He was laid to rest with great ceremony in the old Cathedral of St. Paul in London, that vast and ancient church that stood at the heart of the capital in those days, in a magnificent tomb beside his first Duchess, the lovely Blanche. The two of them together beneath a splendid monument that would stand for centuries, until the old cathedral itself was swept away in a later age by fire. And Catherine, his widow, stood at the close of his life, as she had stood through so much of it, a little to the side, honoured now and lawful, but not, even in his death, quite at the very centre of him. For that place beside him in the tomb was kept for the love of his youth. She had won the marriage, and the name, and the open love at the last. and with those she was content. The Dowager Duchess mourning the prince, who had been, for the better part of both their lives, the whole centre of her world. We do not know how Catherine bore his death, for as ever the record is silent on her heart, but we may imagine that it fell on her heavily, for she had loved him through the whole of her life. From her young womanhood to her old age, and with him gone, the great central fact of her existence was gone too. She had built her whole life around that love, suffered for it, waited for it, been raised by it at the last to greatness. And now the man, at the centre of it all, was dead, and she was alone. An old woman in her widow's weeds, the long story all but over. She had her honours still, her dower lands, her title, her children rising about her. She was not destitute or cast down, but secure and esteemed, the Dowager Duchess of the greatest house in the land. We may picture her in those last years, settled again in her beloved Lincoln, in a fine house in the cathedral close, living the dignified life of a great dowager, surrounded by the comforts her rank and her dower lands afforded her. There would have been her household about her, her gentlewomen and her servants, the ordered round of her days, the devotions in the soaring church, the management of her lands and affairs, the visits of her children and her grandchildren, the quiet, honoured life of a noblewoman in her later years. She had come back, in the end, to the city that had sheltered her through her years of shadow, and made it the place of her dignified age. The great cathedral that had witnessed her marriage now, the centre of her widowed peace, its towers above her, its bells marking her hours, its quiet close the setting of her final years. After all the drama of her life, the court and the manor, the love and the scandal, the renunciation and the triumph, she ended in stillness and in honour, a noble lady at rest in a quiet cathedral city, her storms all behind her, her place secure, her family great. It was a good ending, a peaceful harbour after a long and a stormy voyage, and there is a deep contentment in the picture of it. The woman who had endured so much, living out her last days in dignity and peace, beneath the soaring stone of the church she loved, waiting, without fear now, for the quiet close that would lay her at last beneath that same beloved stone. But the thing that had given her life its meaning and its shape was ended, and the years that remained to her were the quiet closing of a tale whose great chapters were all behind her. She did not long survive him, as though, the central thread of her life once broken, little was left to hold her, and within a few years she would follow him into death and be laid in her own tomb beneath the cathedral she had loved. There is a quiet fittingness in that too, that she did not linger alone, but followed soon after the prince who had been her whole world. The two of them passing within a few years of each other, out of the age they had so marked, into the silence and the stone where we must leave them. There is a poignancy in the manner of his burying that touches the heart of Catherine's whole story, for the Duke, by his own wish, was laid to rest not beside Catherine, his wife of his last years, but beside Blanche, the lovely first Duchess of his youth, the radiant lady he had married for love so long ago, the two of them together in a splendid tomb. Whatever we make of it, and it may have been simple piety, or the keeping of an old promise, or the pull of a first and a formative love, it left Catherine, his wife at the last, to lie elsewhere, apart from him in death after all the years she had longed to be openly his in life. We should not read too much sorrow into it, perhaps, for the choice may say less about the Duke's heart in his last years than about the customs and the vows of his age. He had been married to Blanche when he was young, and had loved her truly, and great men often arranged in their wills to lie beside the wife of their youth, or made such promises long before. And the keeping of an old vow need not mean the slighting of a later love. And yet there is no denying the poignancy of it for Catherine, that after all her years of loving him in shadow, After the public renunciation and the patient waiting, and the triumph of the marriage at the last, she would not lie beside him in death, but he would rest instead beside the radiant first Duchess. She herself had served as a girl. It is as though the old Duke's life came full circle at its close, returning him to the love of his youth, while Catherine, the love of his age, the wife who had endured everything to be openly his, was left to her own resting place apart. But Catherine, of all people, understood the long and complicated workings of his heart, and she had never asked to be his only love, only to be truly loved, and that she had been, beyond all doubt, for he had married her against the whole weight of his world, which is a thing a man does only for a love that is real. So if she minded the parting in death, and we do not know that she did, she had still the knowledge that she had been loved enough to be made his Duchess, which was more than the proud world had ever thought she would have, and far more than it had ever wished her. She did not begrudge it, so far as we know. She had gained what she wanted, the marriage, the name, the open and honoured love at the end. And if the old Duke chose to lie beside the wife of his youth, Catherine, who understood better than anyone the long workings of his heart, perhaps understood that too. She was a duchess and a widow, now secure, honoured, her children rising, and she had outlived the scandal and the shame, and stood at the close of her life, a high lady in full possession of her dignity. And the world turned, in her last years, in a way that lifted her family higher still. For the Duke's eldest son, his legitimate heir by the lovely Blanche, a bold and capable man named Henry, had quarrelled with the king and been driven into exile and stripped of his inheritance, and he came back like a storm to claim his own, and finding the kingdom ready to his hand, he reached past his inheritance and took the crown itself, deposing his cousin and making himself king, the first king of the House of Lancaster. So Catherine, in her widowhood, saw her stepson, the boy whose mother she had served, the half-brother of her own Beaufort children, become the King of England, and her own children, the once scandalous Beauforts, become the half-blood kin of the king, lifted by their brother's crown to the very heart of the royal family. There is a remarkable symmetry in this that is worth pausing over, for it draws together all the threads of Catherine's long life. The new king, Henry, was the son of the lovely Blanche. The Duchess Catherine had served as a young gentlewoman so many years before, and he had been a small child in the ducal household in the very years when Catherine was raising his sisters as their governess. She had known him, in other words, since he was a boy, had been a familiar figure of his childhood, the gentle governess in his father's house, and now that boy was the King of England, and Catherine was his stepmother, the wife of his late father, the dowager of his own house of Lancaster. There is reason to think the bond between them was a real and a warm one, for the new king honoured Catherine as his stepmother and his kinswoman, and treated her Beaufort children, his own half-brothers and half-sister, as trusted and beloved relations, raising them to high office and keeping them close. He had known her, after all, since his childhood, the gentle presence in his father's house, the woman who raised his sisters, a familiar figure of his earliest years, and whatever the scandal that had attached to her, she was woven into the fabric of his own family and his own beginnings. For an usurper newly come to a contested throne, the loyalty of close kin was beyond price, and the king found in Catherine's children some of his most faithful and most capable supporters, the half-blood family that stood by the new dynasty through all its early dangers. So Catherine, in her last years, was not merely an honoured dowager, but the matriarch of a family bound by the closest ties to the new king, the stepmother of the crown, her children the king's trusted brothers, her blood now part of the inmost circle of the royal house. The poor heroic girl had become kin to the King of England, honoured at his court, her family raised to the heights of his favour, and she lived out her final years secure in the esteem of the very throne. The long climb of her life completed in this last unlooked-for elevation, the scorned mistress become the honoured kinswoman of the king, and his half-brothers and half-sister, Catherine's own Beaufort children, were now the king's close kin, his trusted relations, raised by his accession to the inner circle of the royal family. The wheel that had lifted Catherine from knight's widow to duchess now lifted her children from scandalous bastards to the brothers and sister of a king, and Catherine, in her old age, stood at the centre of a family that had climbed, in a single generation and largely through her, from the margins to the throne itself. The poor heroic girl from the Queen's nursery was the matriarch now of a clan bound by blood to the crown of England, the stepmother of the king, the mother of his powerful kinsman, and she had lived to see it. The long, obscure patience of her life flowering, at its very end, into a greatness that touched the throne. The people of Catherine's age had a favourite image for the strange risings and fallings of fortune that her life so perfectly embodied, and it was the wheel of fortune, a great wheel forever turning, with figures clinging to its rim, some rising toward the summit, some crowned in glory at the top, some falling, some crushed beneath, and the wheel never resting, so that no height was secure and no depth was final. It was an image born of a world in which fortune did indeed seem to lift and cast down with little regard for merit or right, in which the great might fall and the low might rise by the turning of events no one could control, and it was used, above all, as a warning to the proud, that those whom the wheel had lifted it would in time bring down. But Catherine's life is the rare and the happy case in which the wheel, having held her long near its bottom, carried her at the last all the way to the top and let her rest there, the obscure made great, the shamed made honoured, the patient endurance of a lifetime rewarded at its close. She had clung to the wheel through its long, slow turning, through obscurity and scandal and renunciation, never quite cast off and never yet raised up. And at the very end it lifted her, the knight's widow becoming a duchess, the mistress becoming a wife, the shadowed mother becoming the ancestress of kings. It is the shape of a life that the people of her age would have recognised at once, the wheel of fortune turning, though in her case it turned against the usual run of such tales, not toward a fall, but toward a triumph, and a triumph the more satisfying for the long patience that had earned it. Her son Henry Beaufort was already rising in the church toward the wealth and the power that would make him a cardinal and the right hand of kings. Her son John was an earl. Her daughter Joan was married into the mighty family of Neville and was busy bearing the high brood of children who would scatter her blood through all the high houses of the land. Of all her children, it was perhaps Henry, the churchman, who climbed the highest in his own lifetime, for he rose to be a bishop of one of the richest sees in England, and then a cardinal of the universal church. And he gathered into his hands a wealth so vast that he became the great banker of the crown, lending huge sums to kings to fund their wars, a figure of immense power in the government of the realm, for decade after decade, outliving his own generation to dominate the next. To have borne a son who became a prince of the church and the financial master of the kingdom would have been triumph enough for any mother. But it was through her daughter Joan that Catherine's blood would spread the furthest and reach the highest. For Joan, married to the head of the mighty house of Neville, bore child after child, a great tribe of sons and daughters who married into every corner of the high nobility, so that within a generation or two, Catherine's descendants were threaded through the whole aristocracy of England. Among Joan's many children would be a daughter who married the Duke of York and became the mother of kings, and among her descendants would come the line that produced the Tudors, so that the blood of the knight's daughter from the Fenland manor flowed. through her daughter Joan above all, into the veins of the royal house itself. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of the kinship that Catherine founded through this one daughter, for it is hard to overstate. Joan Beaufort married the head of the great northern house of Neville and bore him a vast family of sons and daughters, and these in turn married into the highest houses in the land, the Nevilles becoming, within a generation, one of the mightiest and most far-reaching connections in all of England, their marriages threading Catherine's blood into family after family at the very summit of the realm. Through these Neville grandchildren and their children, Catherine became the ancestress of a sweeping swath of the nobility that would fight on every side of the wars that broke upon England in the century after her death. So that the rival houses that tore the kingdom apart were, many of them, descended alike from the quiet woman who had been a governess in a ducal household. There is a strange irony in that so much of the blood that would be spilled in those terrible quarrels ran back to a single source in Katherine Swynford, the peaceable founder of warring lines, the gentle ancestress of a fierce and a divided posterity. But that lay far ahead, in years she would never see. In her own time, the marriages of her grandchildren were simply the rising of her family into greatness, the spreading of her line through the high houses of the land, the once scandalous Beauforts becoming, through Joan above all, the kin of half the kingdom and the root of the royalty to come. Catherine did not live to see most of this vast unfolding, the cardinals and the queens and the kings who would descend from her. But she lived to see it begin, to see her children rise from scandal to greatness, and she must have known, in her old age, that the family she had founded in shame was climbing toward the very summit of the kingdom. The woman the chroniclers had called a harlot was now the mother of earls and bishops and the kinswoman of the king, the matriarch of a family climbing to the summit of the kingdom, and she lived to see it, the long vindication of her life completed in the rise of the children of her scandalous love. Catherine did not long outlive her duke. Within a few years of his death, she died herself, an old woman now by the measure of her time, in the city of Lincoln, where she had spent so much of her life in the shadow of the great cathedral she had loved. Death, in that age, was a thing met with ceremony and with faith, surrounded by the rites of the church that gave it meaning and softened its terror, and a high lady like Catherine would have died, we may hope, in the way her world thought right. To die well was a serious art in that age, prepared for across a lifetime, and a good death meant dying in one's bed, in one's right mind, with time to set one's affairs in order and to make one's peace with God. The priest summoned, the last rites given, the sins confessed and absolved, the soul commended to heaven in the presence of family and household. Catherine, dying in her cathedral city, surrounded surely by the comforts of the faith she had lived within and the care of those who loved her, would have made her end in this way, ordering her affairs, providing for her people, turning her thoughts to the heaven she had been taught to hope for, slipping away with the church's blessings about her. It was the death her age esteemed, the peaceful passing of an old and an honoured woman in her own place after a long life, with time to prepare, and it stands in gentle contrast to the violent and sudden deaths that took so many in her dangerous century, on battlefields and scaffolds, and in the swift grip of the plague. Catherine, who had endured so much, was granted at the last the mercy of a quiet end, dying old and honoured and at peace in the city she had made her home, and being laid to rest with all the rites of the church beneath the soaring stone she had loved, her long life closing as gently as a long day closes into the dark. And there, in that vast and beautiful church, she was buried, in a fine tomb in the choir. The Duchess of Lancaster laid to rest with honour among the great, the poor knight's daughter ending where no one could have dreamed she would, beneath the soaring stone of one of the loveliest cathedrals in England. Her tomb was raised in a place of honour within the cathedral she had loved, a fine monument worthy of a duchess, and for centuries it stood there in the choir, a quiet stone testimony to the astonishing arc of her life. In time, her daughter Joan, the Countess of Westmoreland, who had scattered Catherine's blood through half the noble houses of England, would be laid to rest near her mother. The two tombs together beneath the grand church, mother and daughter, the founder of the line and the woman through whom it spread side by side in the Lincoln stone. There is something deeply fitting in her ending there in that particular place. For Lincoln had been the city of her years of shadow and her years of triumph, both, the quiet harbour of her retirement and the scene of the great marriage that crowned her life. And now it became her resting place, holding her bones beneath the soaring stone she had lived so long beneath. Within the choir, she lay among the honoured dead of the cathedral, bishops and dignitaries and benefactors, her monument standing in that holy company, and those who came after, kneeling at their devotions in that hushed and jewelled space, would pass her resting place down the generations without always knowing what manner of woman lay beneath the carved stone, the gentle ancestress of the very kings under whom they lived. And there she lay, through all the centuries that followed, while her blood ran on through kings and queens who never knew most of them, that they carried in their veins the inheritance of the woman who slept beneath the choir at Lincoln. The Duchess, who had once been called a harlot, the ancestress of the throne. Consider, for a moment, the whole vast circle of her life, from its beginning to its end, for it is one of the most complete arcs any life has ever traced. She began as a small foreign child, living on the charity of a queen, a poor herald's daughter, with nothing of her own, set down in a household that was not hers, raised among the great on sufferance, and she ended as a duchess in a cathedral tomb, the ancestress of kings, her blood destined for the throne of the nation that had taken her in as a penniless girl. Between those 2 points lay the whole astonishing journey, the muddy manor and the noble household, the secret love and the public shame, the foreshadowed children and the renunciation and the long patient waiting, and then the cathedral marriage and the crown of honour at the last. Few lives have ever travelled so far, from so low a beginning to so high an end, and fewer still have done it as Catherine did. Not by conquest or by scheming, but by the quiet powers of love and endurance and patience, the gentlest of forces carrying her the greatest of distances. The wheel had come full circle for her, from the Queen's household where her story began to the Duchess's tomb where it ended, and she had ridden it all the way, holding fast, enduring, loving, and at the last she rested, her long journey done, beneath the stone of the church she loved, in the city that had been her harbour, her whole strange, triumphant life behind her. Her daughter Joan, the Countess of Westmoreland, would in time be buried near her, mother and daughter together in the Lincoln stone, and for centuries their tombs stood there, the resting place of the woman who had been a temptress and a duchess and the ancestress of kings. To be buried in such a place was itself a kind of immortality, for the great cathedral endured generation after generation, and those laid within it were held in its memory and its prayers, long after the world that had known them was gone. The canons of the church would keep the anniversaries of the great dead, the masses said for their souls, the names remembered in the daily round of the cathedral's devotions, so that Catherine was not simply buried and forgotten, but held, in a sense, within the living memory of the vast church she had loved, her name carried forward by the prayers of those who served it. And she lay there in honour, the Duchess in her tomb of fine stone, through all the storms of the centuries that followed, the wars and the upheavals that swept over England, while her blood ran on and on through the royal line she had founded, mingling in the veins of the very monarchs under whom those storms broke. There is a strange and a moving thought in it, that the kings and queens of the centuries after her, ruling, warring, rising and falling, carried within them the inheritance of the quiet woman asleep beneath the choir at Lincoln, and that few of them, caught up in their great affairs, ever paused to think of her, the herald's daughter, at the root of their royalty. She asked for no such remembrance, perhaps content to rest in the church she loved, her long journey done. But the cathedral kept her, and the bloodline carried her, and the story, against all the odds of 600 years, did not die, so that we may sit here tonight, in the quiet and the dark, and remember her still. Katherine. The poor girl who loved a prince and became the mother of kings, at peace at the last, beneath the soaring stone. She died in possession of everything she had spent her life reaching toward, her love honoured, her name a duchess's name, her children great, her long endurance rewarded at the last. The girl who had begun on a queen's charity ended a duchess in a cathedral tomb, and the love that the world had condemned had outlasted every condemnation and come against all the rules of her rigid age, to a triumphant close comarque. And then her true legacy began to unfold. In the generations after her death, a legacy so vast that it dwarfs even the drama of her life. For, from Catherine's children, the once scandalous Beauforts, there came down a flood of royal blood that would fill the throne of England for centuries. Her daughter Joan, married to the mighty Earl of Westmoreland, bore a proud brood of children, and through them Catherine's blood spread into nearly every noble house in England, and in particular into the House of York. For Joan's daughter, Cecily Neville, would marry the Duke of York and become the mother of two kings, Edward and Richard. And through Catherine's grandson, the son of her son John Beaufort, there came a granddaughter, a small, determined woman named Margaret Beaufort, who would pour her whole life into the cause of her only son, and that son, carried to the throne at the last on the thin thread of Beaufort blood, would become King Henry, the first of the House of Tudor, and the founder of the most famous royal dynasty in English history. There is a deep kinship between those two women across the generations. Catherine and her great-granddaughter Margaret, for both were small in their beginnings and vast in their consequence. Both poured their lives into love and family rather than into power directly, and both became, through their devotion and their endurance, the mothers of kings. Margaret carried the very blood Catherine had given to the line, the Beaufort inheritance that flowed from the scandalous love in the ducal household, and she carried it, against every danger and every discouragement, all the way to the throne, founding upon it the dynasty that would shape England for 100 years and more. It was Catherine's blood, in the end, gathered and guarded and carried by her determined great-granddaughter, that founded the House of Tudor, so that the most famous royal line in English history sprang, at its root, from the governess who loved a prince. So through both the White Rose and the Red, through York and through Tudor, the blood of Katherine Swynford came down to the crown, and every English monarch from her grandson's day to our own carries in their veins the blood of the poor knight's daughter who loved a prince. She is, in the truest sense, an ancestress of the nation's kings and queens, the low-born woman at the root of the royal tree, and the chroniclers who tried to blacken her name would be astonished, could they see it, to learn whose grandmother she became. The breadth of her descent, once you begin to trace it, is almost dizzying. For her blood ran not into one royal line, but into several. Through her daughter Joan and Joan's daughter Cecily, it flowed into the House of York and the kings Edward and Richard. Through her son John and his granddaughter Margaret, it flowed into the House of Tudor and the line of kings and queens that followed, the most famous dynasty in English history. And through another of her granddaughters, a daughter of that same son John, it flowed north across the border into the royal house of Scotland, for this granddaughter was married to the King of Scots and became the ancestress of the Scottish kings, who would in time inherit the throne of England as well and unite the two crowns. So from the body of Katherine Swynford there descended, in the generations after her, the royal lines of both England and Scotland. The houses of York and Tudor and the kings of Scots, knitting together through her the whole later royalty of the island. There is a deeper pattern here that is worth drawing out, for the Duke's blood reached the throne by two separate rivers, and Catherine fed one of them. By his first duchess, the lovely Blanche, the Duke had his lawful heir, the son who seized the crown and founded the royal house of Lancaster, so that through Blanche, the Duke's blood sat directly upon the throne in the kings of that line. And by Catherine, his last love, he had the Beauforts, barred by that careful clause from the throne itself, and yet it was through these very Beauforts, through Catherine's children, that the crown would descend in the end. When the line of Lancaster failed, and the inheritance passed through the Beaufort blood to the Tudors and beyond. So the Duke became the ancestor of the English monarchy twice over, by two women, the lawful line through Blanche, and the line that triumphed in the end through Catherine. And it is a strange and a fitting thing that the love the world had condemned should have proved, in the long run, the more enduring of the two, the secret blood outlasting the lawful. The Beauforts of the scandal, carrying the crown that the proud legitimate line could not keep. Catherine, the mistress, the scorned one, turned out to be the ancestress through whom the monarchy survived, her despised children, the channel through which the royal blood flowed on when the honoured line ran dry. There is no justice the chroniclers would have recognised in that, but there is a justice in it, all the same, the deepest her story holds. That the woman they cast down became in the end the very root of the throne they served. Nearly every monarch who has worn the English crown from the 15th century onward, and every monarch of Scotland after a certain point, and so every sovereign of the United Kingdoms down to the present day, carries in their veins the blood of the poor herald's daughter who was raised on a queen's charity and loved a prince. It is one of the most extraordinary facts in all the genealogy of royalty, that so vast a river of kings should spring from so humble a source, from a woman her own age dismissed as a low-born harlot, and it is the final and the most complete vindication of her life, written not in any chronicle, but in the very bloodline of the thrones. It makes you think, her story, about how much of the great course of history is shaped quietly, in private hearts and private choices, by people the chroniclers never thought worth recording. The mighty events of her age, the wars and the risings and the depositions, fill the histories, the deeds of kings and dukes and armies. But beneath and behind all of that, a governess and a prince fell in love in a quiet household, and made their private choice to hold to that love against the world. And from that small and unrecorded thing there came, in the fullness of time, a line of kings. The great public dramas thundered on, and Catherine took almost no part in them, a woman at the edges of the records, glimpsed only here and there, and yet through her, through one woman's love and endurance, the whole future shape of the monarchy was quietly determined, the blood of the thrones to come gathered in her body and passed down through her children. It is a reminder that history is not made only in the loud places, the battlefields and the council chambers, but also in the quiet ones, the households and the hearts, by people whose names the great chronicles barely trouble to record, and that the patient choices of the overlooked may shape the world more deeply in the end than all the clamour of the mighty. Catherine was one of those still architects, a woman who changed the course of a nation not by ruling or fighting, but simply by loving and enduring, and her hidden life turned out to matter more, in the final reckoning, than 100 louder ones that filled the chronicles of her day. There is a reason, in the end, that we remember her, and that her story has been told and retold across 600 years, while the names of her proud detractors have faded into the dust of their chronicles. It is because hers is a story of love that endured, of dignity held fast through her disgrace, of a woman who was scorned by the whole weight of her world and who outlasted the scorn and was vindicated in the end beyond anything the scorners could have imagined. She did not fight her age or rage against the injustice done to her. She simply endured it with grace and held to the love that was at the centre of her life, and waited, and at the last the world turned and gave her everything it had once denied her. There is something in that, something quiet and deep and true, that reaches across the centuries and touches us still. The poor girl who became a duchess, the mistress who became a wife, the scandal who became the grandmother of kings, the love that would not die. And it is good, on a quiet night like this one, to remember her, Katherine, and the long, patient triumph of her life. If these long nights and these old stories are something you would like to find your way back to, you are very welcome to stay a while in this company, and to let this be a place you return to when the dark comes early and sleep is slow in coming. There is no need to do anything at all, not now. There is only the dark and the warmth and the life behind you, now. The candlelight and the cold stone and the soaring church and the love that outlasted every scorn all growing soft and far away, the Duchess and her prince sinking gently down into the deep well of the past where they belong. While you, here, now, safe and warm and far from all of it, let go of the day at last and drift towards sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.